In Regency, England, a glittering Christmas house party lies ahead, or so they think. But when a winter storm drives a small company of travellers off the road, they find themselves snowed in, not in splendour, but at Briar Dower House, smaller, plainer, and far less ready for guests than anyone could wish. With fires to light, meals to contrive, and Christmas fast approaching, comfort must be made by hand. And in such close quarters, even the most unexpected feelings may begin to stir. Wherever and whenever you are listening, may I wish you a very Merry Christmas. And keep a sharp eye on the chapter images. There is a hidden gingerbread man in every one. See if you can find them all. Christmas at Briar begins now. Chapter 1. The Winter Road. By late afternoon on Christmas Eve, the snow had given up all pretense of being picturesque and become purely vindictive. It struck the carriage in gusts, blurred the hedgerows, and made the way ahead look less like a road than a bad decision. Inside, 6 passengers and a great quantity of winter wrappings had been packed together with all the optimism of people who had begun the journey in daylight and good spirits. The daylight was nearly gone, and the spirits were not what they had been. Miss Louisa Hartwell, who sat wedged between Miss Augusta Penrith and the side of the coach with as much composure as the circumstances allowed, had begun the journey with every intention of being cheerful. Invited from London to Windermere by an old-school friend, she had expected nothing more strenuous than polite conversation, candlelight, and the ordinary fatigue of travel. Instead, she had spent the last hour trying not to slide into Lady Honoria at every rut and discovering that winter house parties were discussed much more comfortably than they were reached. They had left London the previous morning in the full expectation of reaching Windermere by Christmas Eve, there to join a house party assembled for the season and all its usual promises. Music, cards, an excellent table, and enough candlelight to improve both furniture and character. At the beginning of the journey, this had seemed not merely possible but inevitable. By noon it had still looked likely. By late afternoon, with the coach swaying deeper into the country and the snow coming down as if personally affronted, Windermere had begun to feel less like a destination than a story people told one another for comfort. Lady Honoria Beckett shifted under a plaid rug, a dark cloak, 2 shawls, and the general conviction that she had been outrageously used. "I have always said," Lady Honoria declared, "that no one with any sense travels on Christmas Eve." Lady Honoria had been handsome once, and was handsome still in a larger, more upholstered fashion, with lively eyes, expensive habits, and a long practice of expecting comfort to appear before she had quite asked for it. Widowed some years before, she had arranged her life so successfully around her own convenience that any interruption to it now struck her as not merely unpleasant, but faintly improper. "You complain whenever you are made to travel, Aunt, though in this case, I do feel you may be right. My bonnet is suffering." Miss Arabella Sutton, Lady Honoria's niece, had grown up with the full benefit of beauty, flattery, and a family far too ready to forgive her for both. Pretty enough to be indulged and vain enough to expect it, she now moved through life with the serene conviction that inconvenience was something which happened chiefly to other people. Miss Augusta Penrith, who sat beside her in neat dark merino, and looked as if she had been born resigned to other people's nonsense, lowered her eyes for a moment. Louisa had already seen enough of her to recognize the movement for what it was. Miss Penrith was amused and had no intention of letting anyone know it. She had the air of a woman whom life had long expected to be useful and uncomplaining, and who had met both demands with such dry composure that many people no doubt mistook her patience for indifference. Across from Louisa, Mr. Felix Harcourt rubbed a clear patch in the misted glass with the back of his glove, and peered out like an overgrown schoolboy. "If the roads do not kill us," Felix said cheerfully, "Windermere will revive us. I mean to eat at least 3 mince pies, and perhaps a 4th if they are small." Felix was one of those cheerful young gentlemen produced by good families in order to keep more serious relations from becoming too comfortable. Fair-haired, friendly, and almost incapable of silence when silence was most required. He had a gift for lifting the spirits of a room, and a still greater gift for exhausting its more orderly inhabitants. Lady Honoria looked at him with the weariness of a woman who had long suspected the younger generation of being raised incorrectly. "Mr. Harcourt, if you insist on being hearty, do it more quietly." Felix grinned and sat back, perfectly unabashed. Louisa drew her warm brown pelisse more closely about her and looked, not for the first time that day, at Lord Adrian Rowley. As the younger brother to the Earl of Wexford, he had the sort of face and manner that led people to expect ease from him before they expected substance. He was handsome, well-dressed, and perfectly at home in company, with that polished composure which suggests a life in which discomfort has been kept at a respectful distance. Whether there was anything firmer beneath the surface, Louisa had not yet decided. He looked what he was, a gentleman used to good tailoring, civilized houses, and a life arranged by invisible hands. His greatcoat was dark and excellent, his linen still fresh, and his expression entirely at ease, as though being crowded into a winter carriage with Lady Honoria and her grievances were no more trying than a polite call in May. Louisa had already decided that he was handsome. That was obvious and not especially interesting. She had also decided that he was probably one of those men who went through life smiling while other people fetched him things. Unfortunately, he had good eyes and noticed when he was being judged. "Miss Hartwell," Adrian said, smiling slightly, "you appear to find the accommodations inferior." Louisa met his look. "Not inferior, my lord, only more intimate than good sense would recommend." Felix laughed outright. Adrian's mouth moved. "Then we must hope the company improves with compression." "That has not yet been proved," Louisa said. This time, even Augusta made a sound that might have been called a laugh, though she suppressed it so promptly that Lady Honoria could pretend not to have heard it. Arabella, who had spent the earlier part of the journey in much better humour, touched the glass with one gloved finger and sighed. "If we arrive half frozen and after dark, no one will look well." "That," said Felix, "depends on one's natural advantages." Arabella gave him a look of patient contempt. "I was not speaking of you." She had been speaking, Louisa reflected, for hours now, of the Wintermere Christmas party and all its expected pleasures. Arabella had described the ballroom, though she had not seen it in 2 years, the musicians, though none had yet been heard, and the gentlemen, though they were all still imaginary. Among those gentlemen, one in particular had shone brighter than the candles. Lady Honoria, who spoiled her niece with the zeal of a woman doing charitable work, had encouraged every word. Felix, being Felix, now said, "Miss Sutton has only supported the journey so bravely because she expects to be rewarded by an earl at the end of it." Arabella coloured, not enough to injure her looks, but enough to improve them. "I do not know what you mean." "Do not be absurd," said Lady Honoria. Arabella was given every reason to suppose the Earl of Wexford would be among the guests. There was a brief and highly enjoyable silence. Lord Adrian Rowley, who was the Earl of Wexford's younger brother, adjusted his gloves and said, with perfect calm, "My brother will be mortified to learn his absence has already cast such a shadow over Christmas." Arabella flushed to the roots of her fair hair. "I did not mean," she began, and then, as she plainly did not know how to end, gave it up altogether. Lady Honoria drew herself up at once, as if dignity might still be salvaged by posture alone. "My niece merely repeated what she was told," she said, with an emphasis which suggested that if anyone had behaved badly it was certainly not Arabella. Felix looked determinedly at the window. Augusta examined the trim of her muff. Louisa lowered her head very slightly and hoped it concealed the fact that she wanted to laugh. Adrian saw it anyway. His expression altered just enough to show that he had not missed a thing, and that he found her amusement considerably more entertaining than Arabella's disappointment. Outside, through the blurred glass, Colonel Nathaniel Ford rode alongside with his head bent against the weather, his coat white at the shoulders with snow. He had joined them that morning at the last posting in and, finding the coach already stuffed with passengers, rugs, shawls, and general indignation, had chosen the saddle instead with the quiet decisiveness of a man who preferred cold air to close quarters. A retired army officer on half pay, he looked exactly what he was, broad-shouldered, weathered, and built for rough going, as solid and practical as the rest of them looked increasingly ornamental. The carriage lurched over a rut. Lady Honoria made a sound of protest. Arabella clutched at her sleeve. Felix braced one boot against the opposite bench. Augusta put a steadying hand against the strap above the window. Louisa glanced out again. The snow was thicker now. The fields had disappeared into whiteness. The road ahead looked uncertain. The light was fading fast, and for the first time that day she thought, with no pleasure at all, that Windermere might be farther away than any of them had meant to believe. For another quarter of an hour, the carriage continued in a manner that might still, with optimism and poor judgment, be called progress. Then the wheels began to slip in earnest. It was a hateful sensation, a dragging uncertainty beneath them, followed by a sudden jolt whenever the coach found purchase again. Snow rattled against the panels. The light beyond the windows weakened until the world outside seemed made of little besides wind, whiteness, and disappointment. Lady Honoria drew her shawl more closely about her shoulders and fixed her gaze upon no one in particular, which was always a sign that she meant to blame everybody equally. "I suppose," she said, "that Windermere will think it spirited to keep people travelling in such weather." "As Windermere has not personally arranged the storm, Aunt," said Arabella, "it seems unfair to hold them responsible." "I am not holding them responsible," Lady Honoria returned. "I am only saying that if I had invited guests for Christmas, I should have ordered better roads." "That is exactly the sort of thing I should like to hear Lord Windermere told to his face," Felix said, laughing so suddenly that the carriage rocked with it. "You will do no such thing," said Augusta Penrith, without opening her eyes. Augusta had the rare gift of sounding calm, even when she was issuing a command. She sat very straight despite the lurching of the coach. One hand tucked into her muff, the other steady against the worn squab beside her. She was not dressed for display, Louisa noticed, but for the season. Her dark wool gown was plain enough to be sensible and cut well enough not to look like a sacrifice. A small gold brooch fastened her travelling cloak at the throat. Nothing about her asked for attention. That had perhaps been true of Augusta for years. She was some 10 years older than Louisa, and had long since settled into that unfortunate female condition in which a woman of intelligence and good breeding ceased to be called young and began to be called useful. Louisa disliked the habit in society, though she had seen it practiced too often not to know how firm it was. Augusta herself bore it with dry patience, and the occasional expression which suggested she found the world rather silly and had decided to let it go on proving it. The carriage gave another violent sway. This time, Arabella cried out, "What was that?" Before anyone could answer, the coach swayed sharply. From outside came the muffled sound of voices, one of them the driver's, and then the unmistakable ring of Colonel Ford's deeper tone cutting across the wind. At once the mood in the carriage altered. Even Lady Honoria stopped speaking. The carriage door opened a crack, letting in a blade of cold air and a flurry of snow. Colonel Ford appeared at it, one gloved hand against the frame. His dark hair had acquired a scattering of white, and the collar of his greatcoat was powdered with snow. "I am sorry to say," he said, "that the drift ahead is deeper than our driver likes, and the road is narrowing." Lady Honoria stared at him. "Then tell the road not to narrow." Colonel Ford, to his credit, did not laugh. "If I had the influence, Lady Honoria, I should have used it an hour ago." "We may go on," Colonel Ford said plainly, "but not quickly, and not wisely. There is a house within a mile or so, if memory serves me." "A house?" Arabella repeated, as if the word itself required better breeding before she could approve it. "A respectable one?" asked Lady Honoria. Colonel Ford's expression did not alter. "It has walls, a roof, and, if Providence is kind, a kitchen. At present, I should rank those advantages highly." Felix, who admired practicality so long as it relieved him of responsibility, said, "There you see, we are saved." "We are not saved," said Augusta. "We are diverted." Louisa turned her head to hide a smile. Adrian saw it, and there it was again, that quick answering amusement in his face, as if the two of them had unexpectedly found themselves listening to the same music. Outside, the wind rose and drove a fresh burst of snow through the open door. Colonel Ford stepped back at once. "Decide quickly," he said. "The horses will not thank us for debating Christmas comforts in a snowdrift." That settled it. Even Lady Honoria, who would certainly have preferred to be consulted by Parliament before any such change in plans, could not argue with the weather. Adrian shut the door again, and the coach lurched forward, no longer toward the grand warmth of Windermere, but toward whatever sort of refuge a nearly forgotten country house might offer to a carriage full of half-frozen gentlefolk on Christmas Eve. The journey had crossed some invisible line. Windermere, with its light, music, and easy elegance, had begun to take on the character of a dream one recalled less clearly every moment. Ahead there was only snow, failing daylight, and the promise of a house that Colonel Ford described as having a roof, which was not, Louisa thought, an encouraging standard. The last mile, if it was a mile, seemed to have been designed by an enemy. The coach lurched, groaned, and slid forward in a manner that inspired no confidence at all. The horses laboured. The lamps threw a poor yellow light into the snow, and every hedge appeared for a moment and vanished again like something reconsidering whether it wished to exist. No one had much to say now. Even Arabella had abandoned complaint in favour of a fixed expression of injured disbelief, as though Christmas Eve itself had behaved badly. Lady Honoria breathed discontent through her nose. Augustus sat as before, calm and upright, though Louisa noticed she had tightened her hold upon her muff. Felix, for once, had fallen quiet. Only the weather remained cheerful. Then Colonel Ford's voice came through the dark. "There," he called. A moment later, Louisa saw it too. Not Windermere, with wide windows and half the county expected within, but a smaller house standing back from the road among bare trees, its shape sober against the whitening dusk. 2 windows showed light. 1 chimney gave out smoke. It looked neither grand enough to impress Arabella, nor ruined enough to satisfy Felix. It looked, which was more to the point, inhabited. The carriage stopped before the door with a final heave. Before the driver could descend, Adrian was already outside. He turned at once to offer his hand to Lady Honoria, who took it as though she were doing him a kindness. Arabella followed, gathering her skirts with offended care. Louisa stepped down next and felt the snow at once through the edge of her boot. The cold struck clean and sharp beneath the smell of wet wool and horse. The house rose before them in dark brick and pale stone, respectable and a little severe, with the air of a place that had not expected company and disapproved of surprises. The door opened. The man who stood there was elderly, thin, and so exactly upright that Louisa's first thought was that he must have been born in black coat and neckcloth, and had merely continued from habit. His silver hair was brushed with great care. His face was long, lined, and perfectly composed. He looked at the carriage, the horses, the snow, the 7 travellers, the luggage, and the general collapse of order. "I see," he said. It was an admirable sentence. It contained resignation, judgment, and a complete understanding of disaster, all without raising his voice in the least. Colonel Ford came up the steps behind Louisa. "This is Briar Dower House, is it not?" he said. "We require shelter." The man bowed, though whether to Ford or to necessity was not clear. "Yes, sir. Briar Dower House, Wetherby, at your service. The family are in town for the season, but the house may still offer such shelter as it can." Behind him, a woman appeared with a candle held high. She was stout where Wetherby was narrow, brisk where he was grave, and had the look of a person who had spent many years preventing other people from doing foolish things and had not enjoyed any of them. Her cap was neat, her sleeves rolled, and her expression sharpened visibly as she counted heads. "How many?" she asked. "Too many," said Felix helpfully. The woman ignored him. "Mr. Wetherby," she said, "where do you expect to put them?" "I had not yet allowed myself to despair, Mrs. Wilmot." Mrs. Wilmot gave a short sniff. "Then you may begin now." Lady Honoria, who had reached the limit of endurance some 20 minutes earlier, said, "My good woman, we require hot rooms, hot water, and something strengthening at once." Mrs. Wilmot looked directly at her. "Then your ladyship ought to have arrived yesterday." Felix turned away so suddenly that Louisa knew he was hiding laughter. Augusta's shoulders moved once. Even Adrian coughed. Arabella, drawing her velvet cloak close, said, "Surely there is at least a proper fire?" "There is a fire," said Mrs. Wilmot. "Whether it is proper depends on what you have been accustomed to." At that, Weatherby stepped aside with the air of a man yielding not his doorway but his principles. "If the ladies and gentlemen will come in," he said, "we shall do what may be done." They entered into a narrow hall panelled in dark wood, with a carpet worn soft in the middle and candlelight catching on old brass. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked with grave composure. The air smelled of beeswax, faint smoke, and rooms long kept in order for people who had not arrived. On a side table stood a small bowl of holly and winter berries. It was a modest thing, no more than a house's quiet acknowledgement that Christmas had come whether anyone was ready for it or not. Louisa saw it and felt, rather unexpectedly, the day settle around her. This, then, was Christmas Eve. Not at Wintermere, with dancing and brightness and Arabella's imaginary earl, but in an old house with 2 servants, too many guests, and snow at every window. Mrs. Wilmot turned with the candle in her hand and said, "If anyone means to freeze, do it in the drawing-room. It is the only place fit for it." "An enchanting welcome," murmured Adrian. Louisa glanced at him. Snow still clung to his dark hair. He looked colder, less polished, and considerably more alive than he had in the carriage. He caught her eye and smiled very slightly. For the first time since the weather had turned, Louisa thought they might not be wholly unfortunate. Only very nearly. Chapter 2. Christmas Eve at Briar. The drawing-room at Briar was warm only by comparison. That is to say, it was warmer than the hall, warmer than the front steps, and infinitely warmer than the road, but it had not yet reached that degree of comfort at which Lady Honoria Beckett considered a room civilized. A fire burned in the grate with an air of doing its conscientious best under difficult conditions. A pair of candles stood on the mantel. The curtains were drawn against the night, though the cold still seemed to have slipped in first and made itself at home. The room itself had good bones. Even Arabella, in the midst of misery, could see that much. The carpet was faded but handsome, the chairs elegant in an old-fashioned way, and the dark wood shone where candlelight found it. A small writing table stood near one window. A bookcase, modest but respectable, occupied one wall. Over the mantel hung a portrait of a lady who had plainly expected better treatment from life and had not quite received it. In one corner, upon a narrow table, stood a shallow dish of winter berries with 2 short sprigs of holly laid beside it. The little touch of colour softened the room, and Louisa guessed it was Mrs. Wilmot's doing. Lady Honoria went straight to the nearest chair and sank into it as though the journey had been not merely long but morally injurious. "I have no feeling at all in my feet," she announced. Felix, who had recovered his spirits the moment he found himself under a roof, said, "Then they are in a better state than the rest of us, for mine feel everything and object to all of it." "Mr. Harcourt," said Augusta, removing her gloves finger by finger, "you are one of those people who believe discomfort becomes less if shared noisily." "I am one of those people," said Felix, "who believe silence improves nothing." "That," said Adrian, taking up a place near the fire without in the least monopolizing it, "depends on the company." Louisa turned away to hide a smile and bent instead to loosen the damp ribbon beneath her bonnet. Her fingers were colder than she had thought. Beside her, Arabella stood in the middle of the room like an ornament that had been unpacked into the wrong house. "This cannot be the drawing-room," Arabella said at last. Mrs. Wilmot, who had entered behind them with the look of a general surveying a battlefield, said, "It is the only room with a fire, miss, and for tonight that recommends it above ceremony." Arabella stared. Mrs. Wilmot, having won the exchange by the simple method of not caring whether Arabella approved, turned to Weatherby. "More coal," she said. "And tell Dawson to see to the horses before they freeze in the yard." "Yes, Mrs. Wilmot," said Weatherby, with the grave resignation of a man who had once expected to spend Christmas Eve polishing silver in peace, and now found himself quartermaster to an invasion. Louisa sat down at last, and let the warmth from the fire reach her a little. It was a curious room, she thought. Not grand, not neglected, not exactly melancholy, though there was a hush about it, as if Briar had spent a long while being tidy for no one in particular, and had not yet recovered from the shock of becoming useful. Adrian, who had removed his gloves and was warming his hands with more success than elegance, glanced toward the holly on the side table. "Briar appears to have made a concession to Christmas," he said. "It has done no such thing," said Mrs. Wilmot. "The house would look bare without something there." "Then Christmas is much obliged to you," Adrian replied. Mrs. Wilmot gave him a look of deep suspicion, plainly uncertain whether he was impertinent or merely light-headed from cold. Lady Honoria extended one hand toward the fire. "I hope," she said, "that whatever is to be done next will be done quickly." Mrs. Wilmot looked at her with calm brutality. "That depends, my lady, on whether your ladyship prefers speed or success." Felix made an alarming noise, which he instantly disguised as a cough. Louisa had begun to think that Christmas Eve at Briar, though not in the least what anyone had intended, might at least prove memorable. If anyone in the room had still been cherishing the hope that Briar's deficiencies might prove temporary, Weatherby put an end to it 10 minutes later. He returned with coal upon his sleeve, dignity still in place, and announced, "Mrs. Wilmot has desired me to explain the present state of the household." No one liked the sound of that. Lady Honoria, who had secured the chair nearest the fire, and looked as if she meant to defend it against armed attack, said, "I should rather have hot water." "You may have the explanation first, my lady," said Mrs. Wilmot from the doorway. "The water will follow if the pipes continue to behave themselves." Arabella sat very upright on the edge of a sofa and gave a little shiver, though whether from cold or grievance, Louisa could not have said. Felix, who had begun to examine the books on the nearest shelf with the air of a man looking for buried treasure, turned back at once. Augusta folded her gloves neatly into her lap. Colonel Ford took up a place near the door, as if he preferred standing where other people could not lean upon him emotionally. Adrian remained by the hearth, not in the warmest part of it, Louisa noticed, though he could easily have claimed it. Weatherby clasped his hands. "The cook and kitchen maid are at the principal house," he said. "The second housemaid was sent yesterday to her mother, who has taken ill. The kitchen boy is 12 and cries in draughts. Dawson remains in the stable. Mrs. Wilmot and I are therefore, for the present, the active strength of Briar." Felix said, "That sounds very nearly military." "It is worse," said Colonel Ford. "In the army one expects trouble." Arabella stared at Weatherby. "Do you mean," she said slowly, "that there is no cook?" "There is Mrs. Wilmot," said Weatherby. Mrs. Wilmot, who did not look flattered by this, said, "There is also a kitchen, miss, but neither it nor I perform miracles after dark." Lady Honoria raised her brows. "Surely some arrangements were made for Christmas?" "Yes, my lady," said Mrs. Wilmot, "for 2 people." There was a silence. Louisa could almost hear the whole room adjusting itself to the fact that their arrival had not enlarged Briar's resources in the slightest, but merely overrun them. Arabella was the first to recover enough to object. "But we cannot simply sit here and have no dinner." Mrs. Wilmot looked at her. "I had not proposed that, miss. I only mentioned that if a party of 7 appears at the door in a storm, on Christmas Eve with no warning and a quantity of luggage, a house does not swell like a pudding to receive them." Felix turned so sharply that Louisa knew he was hiding laughter again. Lady Honoria, who had long held the view that practical difficulties were interesting only after they had been removed, said, "I trust, Mrs. Wilmot, that you appreciate our position." Mrs. Wilmot answered, "At present, my lady, I appreciate my pantry." That was too much for Felix. He laughed outright. "Mr. Harcourt," said Augusta, though there was a dangerous glimmer in her eye. "You encourage her." "My dear Miss Penrith," Felix said. She requires no encouragement from me. Mrs. Wilmot was born prepared. Mrs. Wilmot accepted this with the expression of a woman who would rather have accepted tribute. Louisa glanced across the room and found Adrian watching the exchange with plain amusement. He caught her eye and said, in a low voice meant only for her, "I begin to think Briar has stronger defences than Windermere." "It certainly has fewer illusions," Louisa murmured. He smiled. That smile, Louisa thought unwillingly, improved him. It took some of the finished smoothness from his face and made him look less like a gentleman in a miniature and more like a man one might trust to laugh in the right places. Arabella, meanwhile, had not done with her troubles. "If there are no servants," she said, "what is to become of us?" Felix answered at once, "We shall probably have to roast one another." Lady Honoria gave a small cry of outrage. "For heaven's sake, Felix," Augusta said, "must you always say the first foolish thing that comes into your head?" "No," said Felix. "Sometimes I say the second." Colonel Ford, who had been surveying the room with a practical eye, said, "If the roads are passable by morning, we go on. If not, we stay and make ourselves as little troublesome as possible." Arabella looked at him as if he had suggested life in a ditch. "Stay? If the weather chooses it," Colonel Ford said. She turned at once to Lady Honoria. "Aunt, we cannot remain here." Lady Honoria drew herself up in her chair. "My dear Arabella, do not speak as if we had selected it." "I had not imagined," Arabella said, casting a look about the room, "that Christmas Eve would conclude in a house where no one knows what to do with us." At that, Adrian said mildly, "I believe they know perfectly well what to do with us. The difficulty lies in finding the staff to perform it." Arabella looked at him and then away again, as if it were particularly vexing that the wrong brother should also persist in being sensible. Louisa had seen enough of Arabella already to understand that disappointment sat badly upon her. The poor girl had set out wrapped in velvet and expectation, certain of candles, dancing, and the flattering notice of an earl. Instead, she had found Snow, Mrs. Wilmot, and Adrian Rowley, who was plainly enjoying the entire collapse much more than any man had a right to do. The thought nearly made Louisa laugh. She bent her head instead and busied herself with removing the last pin from her bonnet. What Briar produced that evening could only by courtesy be called dinner, though courtesy was stretched rather thinner than the soup. There was broth, bread, a little cold meat, and enough cheese to remind the company that civilization had not entirely withdrawn. Weatherby served it with wounded dignity, Mrs. Wilmot with open impatience, and the guests received it according to character. Lady Honoria as an insult, Arabella as a disappointment, Felix as a triumph over death, and everyone else as sufficient, which Louisa thought was probably the highest praise Briar could reasonably expect that night. After dinner, Mrs. Wilmot, to whom everyone's romantic disappointments were of no consequence at all, said, "The next matter is rooms." That sobered them all. Weatherby, producing a small notebook from somewhere upon his person with the quiet efficiency of an undertaker producing forms, said, "2 bedchambers in the south passage are in use. 1 may be made ready above this floor if the fire is laid at once. The little room beside it is habitable in summer but not answerable in December. There is also the blue room." Mrs. Wilmot said, "The blue room has not been opened in 3 weeks. Weatherby inclined his head. "Then perhaps it will be grateful for diversion." Lady Honoria closed her eyes briefly, as though praying for patience and not receiving any. "I do not share rooms," she said. "Tonight, my lady," said Mrs. Wilmot, "everyone shares something." That settled it with a brutality no one could resist. Arabella looked ready to expire. Augusta said calmly, "Lady Honoria and Arabella must have the warmest room." There was a faint pause after this. Not because anyone objected, but because several people were clearly tired enough to wish they might. Colonel Ford said, "Naturally." Felix muttered, "There goes justice." Louisa gave him a quick warning glance, but Lady Honoria had already heard enough. "What was that, Mr. Harcourt?" Felix smiled at once. "I said there goes luggage, Lady Honoria. We must all wish yours safely upstairs." Lady Honoria, who liked attention in nearly every form, accepted this. Weatherby went on. Miss Penrith and Miss Hartwell may take the south room. Colonel Ford, if he does not object, may have the little chamber at the back. I do not object, said Colonel Ford. And Lord Adrian with Mr. Harcourt, Weatherby said, with the tone of a man assigning troops to a frontier post, may take the blue room. Felix looked pleased. Admirable. I talk in my sleep, but only when inspired. Then I trust there is room enough for both revelation and remorse, Adrian said. It is large enough for 2 gentlemen, said Mrs. Wilmot. Whether it is equal to Mr. Harcourt remains to be seen. Louisa had not expected it, but the arrangement of rooms, with all its scarcity and small injustices, seemed to make Briar suddenly real. Not a temporary interruption, but a place with limits, habits, cold corners, and old rooms that must be coaxed into service. The house was no longer merely shelter. It had become an inconvenience with architecture. Mrs. Wilmot looked about the room. Now, she said, if everyone means to sleep before dawn, I must know whether the gentlemen are capable of carrying coal without dropping it, and whether the ladies can sit 5 minutes without requiring things. Lady Honoria said, I require many things. Mrs. Wilmot replied, then your ladyship had best begin with patience. It is the cheapest. This time, even Louisa laughed, though she hid it behind her hand. The business of getting 7 unwilling guests upstairs proved nearly as complicated as a military retreat, though with more shawls. Weatherby led the way with a candlestick held high and the expression of a man escorting civilization through a dangerous country. Mrs. Wilmot followed close behind to prevent anyone from making a poor choice in ignorance. The rest came after in a slow and uneven procession of damp hems, weary tempers, and luggage which seemed to multiply upon the stairs. The staircase at Briar was narrower than Lady Honoria thought proper, and steeper than Arabella approved of. Felix, carrying 2 valises and a hat-box he had no business carrying at all, nearly collided with a small table on the landing, and was saved from disgrace only by Augusta's quick hand upon his sleeve. If you break your neck, Augusta said, do try not to do it on the best carpet. Felix looked down. Is this the best? No, said Mrs. Wilmot from below. And keep your boots to the middle. The runner is older than you are. Colonel Ford, who had taken a trunk as if it weighed no more than a folded cloak, went up without comment. Adrian came after with an armful of cloaks, having refused to let Weatherby add one more burden to his own. Louisa, who was carrying only her reticule and a small case, found herself watching the broad line of Colonel Ford's shoulders and Adrian's easy balance on the turn of the stairs with more interest than the occasion deserved. That, she thought, was fatigue. At the head of the staircase, the passage ran long and dim, with panelling darkened by age and a carpet that softened every step. Candles had been set here and there in wall sconces, but the light reached only so far. Beyond it, the corridor seemed to retreat into old shadows and colder air. Somewhere, a casement rattled faintly in the wind. Lady Honoria stopped at once. I shall take cold in this passage. Mrs. Wilmot, who was opening the nearest chamber, said, Then your ladyship had best continue into the room. It was, by universal agreement, the warmest room available, though this was rather like being called the driest place in a rainstorm. A fire had been laid and persuaded into life. The curtains were heavy, the bed large, and the dressing table draped in one of those covers which suggest that a house has been waiting politely for better days. Arabella entered and looked round with an expression compounded equally of relief and grievance. It is small, she said. It is indoors, said Felix, passing behind her with the hat-box. One must not despise blessings merely because they have washstands. Lady Honoria seated herself at once on the edge of the bed, as if to establish legal possession. I trust, she said to Mrs. Wilmot, that hot water will be sent. If the kitchen range remains in a good temper, said Mrs. Wilmot. At present it is taking the evening personally. Arabella turned at once. And where am I to put my gowns? Mrs. Wilmot looked at the narrow press in the corner. I should recommend inside it, miss. Felix made a choking sound and escaped down the corridor before Lady Honoria could identify it as laughter. The room assigned to Louisa and Augusta lay farther along the south passage. It was smaller than Lady Honoria's, but better proportioned, and after the first breath of cold at the threshold, Louisa found it unexpectedly pleasant. Two narrow beds stood beneath a dim strip of old chintz. There was a good chest of drawers, a small table, and a fireplace in which the newly kindled flames still seemed undecided about their duties. The curtains were a faded green. A china basin gleamed faintly on its stand. Someone had placed a sprig of holly upon the mantel, perhaps from the same modest supply downstairs. "Well," said Augusta, setting down her bag, "it has walls, a roof, and no Arabella. I call that comfort." Louisa laughed. Augusta removed her bonnet with the practical air of a woman who expected no assistance from the world and did not miss it. Her dark hair, neatly arranged all day, had loosened a little at the temples. It softened her face. "I hope you do not object to sharing," Augusta said. "Not in the least," Louisa assured her. "I am glad of that," Augusta said. "I have reached an age at which one values peace more than privacy." Louisa loosened the ribbons at her throat and said, "I begin to think Briar will teach us all to lower our standards." "Not Lady Honoria," Augusta said. "Her standards would survive the end of the world. She would simply wish it had happened more neatly." From somewhere farther down the passage came Arabella's voice, faint but distinct. "Aunt, I cannot possibly sleep near that curtain. It looks melancholy." "It looks dusty," came Lady Honoria's reply, "which is much worse." Augusta closed her eyes briefly. "There are moments," she said, "when I think the storm was morally instructive." Louisa sat upon the edge of the bed to remove her boots and admitted that the room, though cold at the corners and plainly long unused, had its own modest charm. It was not fashionable, it was not grand. It looked like a room in a house where people had once stayed for quiet rather than display. The sheets, when she touched them, were chilly but clean. That seemed, in the circumstances, nearly luxurious. A knock came at the door. Adrian stood there with a candle in one hand and the expression of a man who had lately discovered his own accommodation and meant to behave well about it. "Mrs. Wilmot sent this," he said. "She believes one candle between two ladies is an invitation to injury." "Mrs. Wilmot grows more admirable by the hour," said Augusta. Louisa looked up. "Please thank her for me," she said, "and thank you as well." Adrian bowed slightly. "I shall claim the easier portion of that duty." In the warmer, softer light of the bedchamber, without his gloves and with snow no longer upon his shoulders, he looked less finished than he had on the road. Tiredness suited him. It made him seem more real and less ornamental, which Louisa could not help thinking was an advantage. His expression changed a little at her thanks, as if the small sincerity of it had pleased him more than he had expected. "Well," he said, "if Briar means to improve me by means of Mr. Harcourt, it has chosen a severe method. Good evening, Miss Penrith, Miss Hartwell." He bowed and went on. Augusta shut the door with a thoughtful face. "He improves," she said. Louisa, who was taking off one glove finger by finger, said, "Does he?" "Oh, yes." In the carriage he was merely handsome. Under inconvenience he begins to acquire substance. There was no sensible answer to that. Louisa bent over her bootlaces instead. Some time later, after hot water had indeed arrived in a quantity too modest for Lady Honoria and entirely sufficient for everyone else, and after the house had begun at last to fall into silence, Louisa found she was not yet ready for sleep. Augusta, who could sleep through almost anything short of artillery, had already settled herself beneath the coverlet and grown still. The fire had improved. The room had not. Cold still lived at the window and under the bed and in all the corners where the candlelight did not reach, yet it no longer felt inhospitable, only old and a little out of practice. Louisa drew on her wrapper, took up the spare candle, and slipped quietly into the passage. Briar had fallen nearly silent. Somewhere below stairs a door closed. From another chamber came a faint creak of boards, then nothing. The candles along the corridor burned low and steady, throwing long shadows over the panelling. On the landing below, she could see the faint shine of holly leaves in the hall and the soft circle of light cast by a lamp left burning. It was Christmas Eve. Not at Wintermere, with music, polished floors, and company dressed for admiration. Not among laughter, card tables, bright gowns, and the sort of supper Arabella had probably been describing for a week. Here there was only an old house, too few servants, cold rooms, tired people, and a fire that had to be coaxed into doing its duty. Yet Christmas had arrived all the same. It had announced itself not with splendour, but with candlelight on dark wood, a little greenery in a dish, and the shared human relief of having found a roof before the weather grew worse. It was a poor exchange for elegance. It was also, Louisa thought, more honest. She stood one moment longer, looking down into the quiet hall. A footstep sounded on the stair. Adrian came up from below carrying a blanket over one arm and regarding it with mild suspicion. He saw her at once and stopped. "Miss Hartwell," he said in a lowered voice, "have you come out to admire the architecture, or merely to avoid it? I might ask the same of you." He lifted the blanket slightly. Weatherby insisted the blue room required this, and did so in such solemn tones that refusal seemed unwise. Louisa smiled. Adrian had thought her pretty on the road, though in a composed and inconvenient sort of way. Here, by candlelight, with weariness softening her face and the chestnut of her hair deepening in the dim passage, she looked less guarded and much more dangerous. He found, rather to his annoyance, that a woman did not need to be lively to be lovely. For a moment they stood there in the dim passage with the candlelight between them, both tired, both less guarded than they had been on the road. "Well," Adrian said quietly, "this is not, perhaps, the Christmas Eve any of us intended." "No," Louisa said, "though I begin to think it may at least be memorable." His expression altered then, just a little. Not broader, only warmer. "I thought," he said, when the carriage stopped, "that the evening could scarcely improve. And now? Now I have a blanket, a fire of doubtful loyalty, and proof that someone else in the house is awake. I call that progress." She laughed softly, and at once was glad she had, because laughter sounded right in the old passage, as if Briar had been too quiet for too long, and welcomed the interruption. "Good night, Lord Adrian." "Good night, Miss Hartwell, and Merry Christmas." "In spite of everything," he said. "Merry Christmas," Louisa said. Then she went back to her room, where the fire had burned lower, and Augusta still slept the sleep of the blameless. Louisa set down the candle, slipped into the cold bed with a small involuntary shiver, and pulled the coverlet to her chin. The room was imperfect, the house was inconvenient. Christmas had gone entirely astray. And yet, before sleep took her, Louisa could not help thinking that Briar, for all its draughts and deficiencies, had already become something more than shelter. Chapter 3. Christmas Morning. Christmas morning at Briar began with a fire that had plainly lost interest in the season. Louisa woke to a grey room, a colder floor, and a grate containing little more than ash and one stubborn red glow. From the other bed, Augusta Penrith stirred and looked toward it with disfavour. "If that is Christmas," Augusta said, "it has made very little effort." Louisa laughed and sat up, then immediately regretted it. The air above the coverlet was enough to punish enthusiasm. They dressed quickly. Louisa chose a dark green wool morning gown and buttoned it with cold fingers. Augusta washed in water that appeared to have spent the night in active resentment and pronounced it wet, which is the most one could say for it. By the time they stepped into the passage, the house had begun to wake in a reluctant and scattered way. Somewhere below came the clatter of something metallic falling with very little festive spirit. "That," said Augusta, pausing on the landing, "was not a Christmas sound." The little dish of holly and winter berries still stood on the table, though one berry lay apart from the rest, as if the arrangement itself had fallen into disarray. From the drawing-room came Lady Honoria's voice. "I do not care what hour it is, Mrs. Wilmot. It is Christmas Day." Louisa and Augusta went in at once. The drawing room was only just warm enough to support human society. The fire had been coaxed back to life, but without conviction. Lady Honoria sat nearest the grate in a striped silk dressing gown and a shawl large enough to reproach the room by itself. Arabella, in pale rose muslin wholly unsuited to reality, stood by the window looking as if Christmas had personally failed her. Felix held a cup and examined it suspiciously. "What is it?" Augusta asked. "I believe it is tea," said Felix. "Though it has the colour of regret," Lady Honoria said. "Do not be absurd, it is weak tea." Mrs. Wilmot, setting down a fresh pot of tea, a small dish of butter, and what bread could be managed, said, "Thank you, my lady." Lady Honoria looked annoyed by the gratitude. Louisa moved at once toward the tray. "May I help?" "You may pour," said Mrs. Wilmot. "It will not grow stronger by waiting." Arabella turned from the window. "Is there no chocolate?" "No, miss." "No rolls?" "No, miss." "No ham?" Mrs. Wilmot looked at her. "Miss Sutton, if I had a cook, 2 maids, and a kitchen full of good intentions, your breakfast might look different. At present, it looks like this." Weatherby entered at that moment with the expression of a man preserving order at personal cost. Adrian followed him, properly dressed, entirely composed, and looking far too well for someone who had spent the night in the Blue Room. A moment later, Colonel Ford came in, with the honest air of a man who had already been outside and disliked the result. "Merry Christmas," said Felix. "Tea?" Adrian accepted a cup and looked into it. "You speak as if courage were required." "It is," said Felix. Louisa poured. The tea came out pale and apologetic. Augusta took a slice of bread and examined it. "Has it been toasted?" "No," said Mrs. Wilmot. "It has been observed." Felix laughed into his cup. Arabella did not. "But surely this cannot be breakfast," Weatherby said, with grave sorrow. "It is the breakfast presently available." "And the eggs?" Arabella asked. "The hot things?" Mrs. Wilmot said. "The eggs exist. Their difficulty is becoming breakfast." There came from the passage a muffled cry, followed by a crash. Felix brightened. Perhaps one of them made a run for it. Mrs. Wilmot shut her eyes briefly. "If that is Tommy," she said, "he will regret his education." She went out at once. In her absence, the room paused. Louisa handed out cups. Augusta divided the bread. Adrian moved a chair nearer the fire for Lady Honoria without remark. Colonel Ford lifted the lid on a dish, found nothing beneath it, and set it down again. Arabella said, in a voice full of injured expectation, "I had thought there would be something special today." Adrian took the least discouraging slice of bread and considered it. "So there is," he said. "We are all being taught to value future breakfasts." Lady Honoria said, "I do not like lessons at breakfast." "No one does," said Arabella. Colonel Ford glanced toward the window. The storm held through the night. Louisa drew back the curtain a little. The yard was white, the lane lost, the world beyond Briar blurred into snow. "We are not going anywhere soon," she said. "Then," said Felix, "someone must improve the eggs." Augusta looked toward the door through which Mrs. Wilmot had disappeared. "That depends," she said, "on whether anyone in this house knows how." There was a silence. Slowly, every head turned toward Weatherby. He drew himself up. "I should not wish," he said, "to raise false hopes." That was the moment Louisa understood the truth. Breakfast had not been delayed. Breakfast had never truly begun at all. Mrs. Wilmot returned with the air of a woman who had just settled one disaster and found 3 more waiting. Behind her came a fair-haired boy carrying a basket of eggs with the solemn misery of a child entrusted with national security. He could not have been more than 12. His nose was red with cold, and he looked as though Christmas had so far offered him nothing but rebuke. Mrs. Wilmot took one glance at the room, the cups, the bread, and the 7 expectant faces, and seemed to arrive at some inward conclusion. "Well," she said, "there is no help for it." No one liked the sound of that. Lady Honoria drew herself up. "No help for what?" Mrs. Wilmot folded her arms. "For the truth, my lady, there is food in the house, but not enough hands to turn it into comfort at the speed you all appear to prefer." Arabella looked blank. I do not understand. That, said Felix, is because you have been brought up too well. Augusta gave him a look. Do be quiet. I should like to hear the terms of our surrender. Mrs. Wilmot ignored them both. Dawson is with the horses, and your coachman with him. Between the stable yard, the harness, and beasts that do not care it is Christmas, they have enough to do without coming in to wait on us. Tommy is useful only in theory. Weatherby can carry a tray, but if I put him to the range, we should all perish nobly before noon. So if ladies and gentlemen expect fires, breakfast, hot water, and any reasonable hope of dinner, they must lend themselves to the business. There followed a pause of remarkable quality. It was the sound of 7 people thinking the same thing at once and refusing, out of dignity, to speak it. Surely not us. Arabella was the first to give the thought a voice. You cannot mean, she said, that we are to work. Mrs. Wilmot looked at her. Miss Sutton, I do not propose to ask you to mend the roof. I only say that eggs do not boil themselves, coal does not walk to the grate, and hot water has never yet developed legs in an English house. Lady Honoria said, This is Christmas Day. Yes, my lady, said Mrs. Wilmot, that is what makes it so inconvenient. Adrian, who had been watching the exchange with open interest, set down his cup. What, precisely, is wanted? Louisa looked at him. She had expected amusement from him, perhaps good humour. She had not expected him to ask a practical question first. Mrs. Wilmot answered at once, like a woman who had been waiting all morning for someone sensible to appear. Coal carried, more wood brought in, the breakfast table laid properly, the second kettle boiled, the upstairs fires seen to. The grates cleaned out before anybody starts carrying on, and unless someone means to milk a hen, the eggs must be dealt with before they change character. Felix said, I should like it recorded that I never meant to milk a hen. Colonel Ford, who had already accepted the ruin of the day and moved beyond it, said, Very good. Who is to do what? There was another, shorter pause. This time everyone looked at Mrs. Wilmot with the wary attention of people who had just realised the conversation included consequences. Weatherby, who had the notebook again, seemed prepared to take names as if for a census of the defeated. Mrs. Wilmot considered them one by one. Colonel Ford and Lord Adrian can carry coal and wood, she said. Mr. Harcourt can carry whatever they forget and stay out of my way until I find him something he is less likely to ruin. Miss Penrith has the look of a lady who can fold linen without turning it into an argument. Miss Hartwell may pour tea, lay a cloth, and prevent the rest from undoing what little order remains. Louisa, who had not expected to be put to use so quickly, said only, Very well. Arabella stared. And what am I to do? Mrs. Wilmot's eyes moved to her rose-coloured morning gown, her pale slippers, and the expression of a woman who had never willingly approached a scullery in her life. You, said Mrs. Wilmot, may begin by not standing in the middle of the room like an ornament. Felix choked on what might have been a laugh and bent over his cup. Lady Honoria drew in a breath. Mrs. Wilmot? My lady? You forget yourself. No, my lady, said Mrs. Wilmot. I remember breakfast. That settled Lady Honoria for a moment. Arabella turned to her aunt at once. Aunt, you cannot think I should carry anything. No, said Lady Honoria firmly. Certainly not. Mrs. Wilmot gave a small nod, as if she had expected no better. Then Miss Sutton may fold napkins, if she can be trusted not to turn them into swans, or sit by the fire and be ornamental in a less inconvenient position. Arabella seemed uncertain whether this was mercy or insult. It is an excellent arrangement, said Adrian gravely. Miss Sutton improves any room by entering it. Arabella brightened despite herself, then seemed to recollect that admiration had not in fact released her from employment. Louisa turned away to hide a smile. Mrs. Wilmot continued briskly. And as there is no housemaid to attend to every private distress, each person will see to the requirements of his own room. There was a brief pause. Felix asked carefully, How private are we speaking of? As private as the chamber pot, sir, said Mrs. Wilmot. If anything wants emptying, the owner may discover an arm for it. Lady Honoria gave a cry of outrage. I never. Even Adrian had to lower his head for a moment. "This is intolerable," said Lady Honoria. "It is temporary," said Colonel Ford. "It is Christmas," said Lady Honoria, as if that settled the matter. "That," said Ford, "does not appear to concern the weather." Mrs. Wilmot said, "Lady Honoria may remain where she is and refrain from requiring things every quarter hour. That will be a contribution." Lady Honoria looked as if she had been informed that breathing was presumptuous. At that exact moment, the boy with the eggs let out a small sneeze. Mrs. Wilmot swung round. "Tommy, if you drop that basket, I shall send you to the stable and let the horses judge you." Tommy clutched the eggs to his chest. Colonel Ford rose at once. "Show me the coal." Adrian stood too. "And me." There was no elegance in it now, no drawing-room ease. Just two men getting to their feet because the room would grow colder and breakfast stranger if they did not. Louisa felt, to her annoyance, a fresh little shift in her opinion of Adrian Rowley. The house had made its terms plain. If Briar was to be warmed, fed, and kept from sinking into complete confusion, they must all help keep it alive. Felix put both hands to the stack of plates. "Not all at once," said Augusta. "Why not?" "Because I should rather eat from them than sweep them up." Louisa moved to the table near the window and began straightening the cloth, setting out cups, and arranging the things into something a little less discouraged. The work itself was simple. The oddity lay in doing it among people who had all expected Christmas breakfast to arrive as if by magic. Adrian came back first, carrying coal with more goodwill than skill. One sleeve and the front of his coat had been dusted with it. Mrs. Wilmot looked at him and said, "My lord, the grate is there. Your coat need not be." He glanced down. "I see I have embraced the task too warmly." Louisa bit back a smile. He caught it at once. "Miss Hartwell, if you mean to laugh, do it openly. I am already compromised." "It is not beyond recovery," Louisa said, "only beyond your tailor." That earned her a quick smile. Colonel Ford came in behind him with wood under one arm and none of it on his person, which made Adrian look decorative by comparison. Mrs. Wilmot pointed to the hearth. "If the gentlemen have finished improving the passage with coal dust, the fire may yet survive the day." They set to work under her direction. Colonel Ford did exactly as he was told. Adrian did the same. When Mrs. Wilmot told him the wood was badly laid, he altered it. When she told him the kettle would boil faster if he shut the lid instead of staring at it, he obeyed at once. Most men, Louisa thought, would either laugh too much or resent being corrected. Adrian did neither. He simply improved. That was unexpectedly attractive. Then Mrs. Wilmot looked round sharply and said, "Now, who among you means to turn those eggs into breakfast?" There was a pause. "I have often felt equal to eggs," said Felix. "You are not equal to toast," said Augusta. "You may begin there." "Toast?" Felix repeated, with the air of a man assigned beneath his merits. "Yes," said Mrs. Wilmot, "bread, fire, and attention. Even you may manage 3 things at once if Providence assists." "I can do eggs," Adrian said. Mrs. Wilmot gave him a measuring look. "Can you indeed?" "I have every confidence." "That," she said, "is usually the beginning of trouble." "Very well. Come here. If you can manage buttered eggs without disgracing the house, we shall all be grateful." Felix took up his position before the kitchen fire with a fork and an expression of exaggerated responsibility. For the first minute he applied himself admirably. By the second he had begun talking. By the third, the first slice was blackened on one side and pale on the other, which Louisa would not have thought possible without effort. Mrs. Wilmot set a pan on the range, put butter into it, and handed Adrian a bowl. "Crack 6. He took up the first egg with great seriousness and broke it neatly enough, until half the shell followed it into the bowl. Felix, without turning from the toast, said encouragingly, "An excellent beginning." "Silence," said Augusta. The second egg survived better. The third did not. By the fourth, Adrian had acquired the focused expression of a man engaged in warfare at close quarters. Louisa stepped nearer in spite of herself. "Gently." "With eggs?" "Especially with eggs." Adrian looked at the cracked shell in his hand. That is a hard lesson to receive before breakfast. She took one from the basket and cracked it cleanly against the rim. Like that. He watched. You make it look easy. I make it look practiced. Mrs. Wilmot, who was listening while pretending not to, said, Miss Hartwell may stir then, if his lordship means to persist in butchery. Adrian gave up the spoon with admirable composure. Louisa stepped to the pan. The butter had begun to brown too fast. Adrian, seeing it at once, moved the pan off the fiercest heat before she could ask. Can it be saved? He said. Yes, she answered. If you stop trying to murder the eggs and hand me that dish. He handed it to her at once. Between them, under Mrs. Wilmot's stern supervision, the buttered eggs at last became something fit for the table. Felix looked into the pan with admiration. There, civilization returns. It limps, said Augusta. But yes. Mrs. Wilmot took the pan, considered it, and gave one short nod. It will do. That, from her, was near triumph. Colonel Ford, having no ambition toward eggs and too much sense for toast, took himself to the ham with a carving knife and proceeded to slice it with military steadiness, as if breakfast in a half-frozen house were merely another campaign best met by order and steel. Within a quarter of an hour, the room had changed. The fire was stronger, the table was laid, a second pot of tea had appeared with more colour than the first, and the eggs, having passed through anxiety, butter, shell, correction, and Lord Adrian's efforts, were at last on their way to the breakfast table. They sat down to what Briar had been able to produce. Eggs, somewhat the worse for Adrian's handling, and much improved by Louisa's. Toast in unequal shades of usefulness, bread, butter, and slices of ham laid out with Colonel Ford's soldierly neatness. For a few blessed moments, everyone was too hungry to speak. Then Arabella tasted the ham and said, with the air of a woman personally betrayed, It is cold. No one answered. Colonel Ford looked at her. Augusta looked at her. Louisa stopped with her cup halfway to her lips. Even Felix, who had been preparing some encouragement of his own, thought better of it. From the sideboard, Mrs. Wilmot turned her head very slowly. Arabella, meeting the collected gaze of the room, coloured. I only meant, she said with diminished spirit, that it is not hot. Mrs. Wilmot, standing by the sideboard, did not mince words. Miss Sutton, in a better ordered house it might be hot. In this one, this morning, it is ham. Felix bent over his plate so abruptly that it was plain he was laughing into it. Louisa took another sip of tea. This, then, was Christmas morning at Briar. Not musicians, not silver covers lifted by footmen, not a great house prepared for admiration. Instead, there were eggs that had required rescue, coal on the rug, and a roomful of respectable people discovering that comfort had to be made by hand. It ought to have felt like disappointment. Instead, in some odd and inconvenient way, it felt more alive. Chapter 4. Christmas in Earnest. Once breakfast had been dragged into existence, Briar gave up all pretense of being a quiet country house and became a campaign. Doors opened and shut. Feet moved overhead. Coal scuttles scraped. Water was carried, kettles boiled. And the little clock in the hall ticked on with an air of private disapproval, as if none of this had been what it expected from Christmas Day. The fire, now properly fed, had improved enough to justify life. The table, lately host to weak tea and a somewhat battered breakfast, had been cleared. Somewhere upstairs, Lady Honoria could still be heard lamenting the barbarism of a house in which no one came when she rang. Though, as no one had rung at Briar since the family left for the season except perhaps Weatherby, this seemed less tragedy than habit meeting resistance. The clearing away of breakfast began hopefully, and ended in reorganization. Felix, who had declared himself perfectly equal to washing up, carried the first basin to the kitchen with the zeal of a man entering public service. For a few minutes there was splashing, cheerful noise, and the unmistakable sound of someone working much faster than experience justified. Then came a crack. Everyone in the drawing room looked up. A moment later, Felix appeared in the doorway holding 2 pieces of what had recently been a plate. "It slipped," he said. Mrs. Wilmot, who had been counting spoons, looked at the fragments, then at him. "Indeed. The basin is treacherous." "The basin," said Augusta, "has not, I think, hurled itself at the crockery." Felix looked down at the pieces with sincere regret. "In my defence, it was a very determined plate." Mrs. Wilmot took the remains from him. "In my experience, sir, plates are seldom the active party." "I can improve," said Felix. "You have already improved 1 plate into 2, said Augusta. That earned a sound from Adrian which was very nearly a laugh. Felix, undiscouraged, returned to the kitchen and broke another within 10 minutes. After that, Mrs. Wilmot removed him from office. "No more washing," she said. "You may dry, carry, or keep silent. I leave the choice to Providence." Augusta, who had plainly reached her conclusion some time before, tied back her cuffs and went in without ceremony. "Give me the cloth," she said. "If Briar is to dine off anything intact, we must proceed on stricter principles." Colonel Ford followed with the air of a man reporting to a sensible campaign. He took up the drying cloth at once and stationed himself beside her. The arrangement answered beautifully. Augusta washed with brisk efficiency and very little wasted motion. Colonel Ford dried each piece and set it aside with military neatness, as if plates, like regiments, improved under correct handling. Felix stood by for a moment, watching them with an expression of injured goodwill. "I see," he said. "I am thought unfit for water." "Not unfit," said Augusta, "only expensive." "You may carry these back," said Ford, handing him a stack of safe, already dried saucers. "If you can manage the distance." Felix drew himself up. "Colonel, I am rebuked, but I remain useful." "In moderation," said Augusta. Louisa, passing the kitchen door with a folded cloth in her hands, saw Felix take the saucers with exaggerated care. Colonel Ford returned to his drying, and Augusta resumed the washing with the calm of a woman who had long expected the world to place foolish things in her path. It was, she thought, a very fair picture of Briar by noon. Nothing was being done in the manner first intended, but most things were being done at last. Louisa stood at the sideboard, folding a cloth round the better china Mrs. Wilmot had at last produced from a locked cupboard. Mrs. Wilmot came in behind them with a box in her arms and set it down on the table. "There," she said. "If Christmas insists on happening, it may at least look as though it has passed through the house." Felix opened it at once. Inside lay a little stale greenery, 2 short lengths of ribbon, some silver paper stars flattened by time, and a quantity of red berries that had plainly seen better Decembers. Louisa smiled. "You kept them." Mrs. Wilmot gave a short sniff. "The house would look bare otherwise." Felix lifted one of the ribbons. "This has certainly known triumph." "It will know it again if you stop waving it," said Augusta. They had just begun to make what they could of it, Louisa tying 1 ribbon neatly round the base of a candlestick while Augusta sorted the least battered of the berries, when boots sounded in the passage. A moment later, Colonel Ford came in with wood under one arm and a modest gathering of holly and ivy under the other. Adrian followed with another armful, less neatly secured, and shedding a little onto the carpet as he came. Felix brightened at once. "There! Christmas has found reinforcements." Colonel Ford set down the wood. The hedge was obliging. Adrian glanced at the open box on the table. "We thought the room looked in need of assistance." Mrs. Wilmot took one look at the greenery and gave the smallest nod. "That," she said, "looks more like Christmas and less like surrender." Colonel Ford looked as he always did. Composed, capable, and built for unpleasant weather. Adrian looked less composed and more interesting. His coat was open, his hair no longer perfectly ordered, and there was a fine line of soot near one cuff that suggested Briar had already begun to put its mark upon him. Mrs. Wilmot took one glance at that too. "My lord, if the wood arrives drier than you, I shall call it a success." Adrian set down his armful beside the hearth. "You encourage me with praise, Mrs. Wilmot." "I encourage no one," she said. "I preserve dinner." Colonel Ford added the rest of the logs to the basket. What next? The south rooms want looking to, said Mrs. Wilmot. There's damp linen to be put by the upstairs fire, and the blue room window seen to before it lets in any more Christmas. Colonel Ford, said Adrian, you hear how my room has been slandered. I hear it has been accurately described, said Colonel Ford. Louisa bent her head over the ribbon, though not before Adrian caught the movement and smiled. The room improved at once. Felix tucked holly above the mantel with more enthusiasm than precision. Augusta corrected his first attempt. Louisa rescued a trailing piece of ivy from his hands and wound it neatly along the shelf below the mirror. Adrian added another sprig near the window, then moved it when Mrs. Wilmot told him it looked as though it had landed there by accident. None of it was grand. The ribbon was reused, the berries a little tired, the holly unevenly cut, but with the fresh green against the dark wood, and the fire beginning to burn properly at last, the room no longer looked abandoned to the weather. It looked occupied and trying. In the hall, Weatherby passed with a tray of polished silver that looked far too elegant for the circumstances. Louisa stepped out after him. I thought there was no one to serve. Weatherby paused and regarded the tray with sorrowful loyalty. There is not, miss, but as it is Christmas Day, I cannot permit the table to look entirely defeated. That, Louisa thought, was perhaps the spirit of Briar in a sentence. When she returned to the drawing-room, Felix had contrived to hang a strip of greenery slightly crooked above the portrait over the mantel. It leans, Augusta said. It aspires, said Felix. It leans, Louisa repeated, and reached up to straighten it. For one brief moment, standing there with cold fingers, a sprig of holly, and the room in pleasant disorder around her, she had the oddest sense that Christmas had not been lost after all. It had merely been reduced to its practical parts: fire, food, greenery, candlelight, and people trying, with varying degrees of grace, not to disappoint one another entirely. It was not Wintermere. It was beginning to look rather better. If Briar had begun to look more cheerful by noon, it was certainly not because everyone within it deserved the credit. Arabella had been given a chair, a bowl, and a heap of Brussels sprouts which Mrs. Wilmot had declared too respectable to waste. She had also been given instructions, which she received as though they were a social injury. I cannot think, Arabella said, holding one between finger and thumb, why they should require so much preparation. Because, said Augusta, they were not grown for your convenience. Arabella dropped it into the bowl as if it had personally insulted her. My hands will never recover. Louisa, arranging spoons on the sideboard, said, They have not yet been seriously tried. That, said Arabella, is exactly what alarms me. Lady Honoria, enthroned by the fire in a shawl the colour of mulled wine, had not forgiven the day for occurring under such conditions. This is not how the 25th of December ought to be spent, she said, with the gloom of a woman addressing Parliament on national decline. Felix, perched on the arm of a chair with holly in one hand, said, No, but as it has begun so, we may as well try to keep it from worsening. Lady Honoria looked at him. Mr. Harcourt, that sort of optimism is very tiring in close rooms. Felix rose at once. Then I shall take it farther off and distribute it among the furniture. He crossed to the mantel and began improving it with more enthusiasm than judgment. The result, though imperfect, was undeniably better than before. A second length of ribbon appeared. Felix found a place for it near the clock. Augusta corrected his first attempt. Louisa rescued a cluster of berries from ruin. Even Arabella, after being assured twice that no one expected her to carry coal, submitted to arranging a small dish of greenery on the table, though she did it with the air of a princess decorating a prison. Adrian came in at that moment with another basket of wood and stopped just inside the door. What, he asked, has happened here? Christmas, said Felix. Intervention, said Augusta. Desperation, said Mrs. Wilmot from the passage. Adrian looked from the ribbon to the holly to Arabella, who was holding a sprig as if it might stain. I see the season has taken on a militant character. It had to, said Felix. No one else was defending it. Lady Honoria gave a sound of lofty impatience. If this is defense, heaven preserve us from victory. Adrian set down the basket and went to the fire. Louisa noticed that he no longer looked in the least like a gentleman who had risen to a well-managed Christmas breakfast. He looked instead like a man who had spent the morning lifting practical things and being corrected by Mrs. Wilmot. It suited him surprisingly well. Mrs. Wilmot entered behind him with a folded cloth over one arm. "My lord, if you have finished acquainting yourself with firewood, you may acquaint yourself with the silver in the back room. Weatherby cannot polish and lay all of it alone." Adrian put a hand to his heart. "Mrs. Wilmot, you strip Christmas of all enchantment." "I strip nothing," she said. "I only require forks." Felix sprang up. "I will help." "You will not," said Augusta. "Why not?" "Because silver ought not to be polished by anyone who uses it chiefly to point while talking." Felix considered this. "That is unjust. I also wave." From the fire, Lady Honoria said, "I cannot think why every room in this house now appears to contain a task." "Because, aunt," said Arabella, trimming a Brussels sprout with evident reluctance, "it is a house." "It was a much better one last night," said Lady Honoria, "when I still imagined servants lived in it." Colonel Ford appeared in the doorway carrying a basket of linen, with the composure of a man who had long ago accepted that life was labour interrupted by weather. "The south room is in order," he said. "The blue room still admits more air than friendship, but less than before." Adrian turned. "Then Briar and I improve together." Colonel Ford looked at him. "Briar improves faster." Louisa bent her head over the spoons, though she was smiling. Felix, denied the silver, seized instead upon a fresh purpose. Before anyone could stop him, he tucked the remaining holly behind the portrait over the mantel. "It is crooked," said Augusta. "It is festive," said Felix. "It is crooked and festive," said Augusta. "That," said Adrian, "describes nearly everything at Briar today." For once, even Lady Honoria looked close to smiling. Louisa stepped back and looked round the room. Nothing matched. The greenery was modest, the ribbon reused, the fire slightly smoky, the company imperfect. It was not grand. It was, against all reason, beginning to feel like Christmas. By 1 o'clock, the house had divided itself into two kinds of people, those who were carrying things, and those who claimed they had only just put something down. Louisa found herself in the kitchen passage with a tray of spoons, a loaf under one arm, and Adrian beside her, carrying a basket of potatoes, with the air of a man who had not expected Christmas Day to involve root vegetables, but was prepared to meet them bravely. The kitchen at Briar was warm in the direct and useful way of all kitchens. The range gave out steady heat. A kettle muttered near the scullery. Mrs. Wilmot stood at the centre of it all, like a commander with flour on her sleeve. "Set the loaf there," she said to Louisa, "not near the edge." Everything falls at Briar if given encouragement. Louisa obeyed. Mrs. Wilmot turned to Adrian. "And those potatoes, my lord, are not ornaments." He set down the basket. "Where do they go?" "That depends on whether you mean before or after peeling." She handed him a knife with grim satisfaction. Louisa had been sent to sort the better napkins from the merely respectable ones, but the drawing question stuck. Adrian, being nearer, gave it a pull. It came open at once and nearly brought him with it. "That," said Louisa, "was more force than elegance." "I have had a morning of being told the same thing in different forms," said Adrian. He began on the first potato with great attention and very poor method. A strip came away, then another, after which the potato looked less peeled than injured. Louisa watched a moment. "You are taking too much with it." "I suspected as much. If you continue at that rate, dinner will consist largely of peelings." He glanced at her. "Then I rely upon you to save us." "That," said Louisa, "is precisely the sort of thing gentlemen say when they hope to be spared." "I am not asking to be spared," he said, "only instructed." That was harder to resist than it ought to have been. Louisa took up another knife and demonstrated. "Thinner," she said. "You want to remove the skin, not the future." He laughed, low and genuine. "Miss Hartwell, I had not known potatoes required delicacy." "Everything does." said Louisa, if one means to eat it later. For a little while they worked side by side. Adrian improved steadily under direction. From the next room came Felix's voice, then Augusta's, then Felix's again in a tone considerably less adventurous than before. "This is not how Christmas usually looks," Adrian said after a time. "No," said Louisa. "At home it was always quieter." "At Hartwell?" she nodded. "My father preferred his own chair and his own pudding to the world in general, but there was always a good fire, and my mother liked the same sprig of holly over the dining room mirror every year." "That sounds reassuring," Adrian said. "In my family, Christmas tended to be governed by my grandmother." "Was she terrible?" "Only in useful ways. She believed every room ought to be warm, the servants fed early, and weak tea a sign of moral collapse." Louisa laughed. "Then she would have perished here by 8:30. She would have seized the teapot from Weatherby and restored the family name." "And your favourite part?" Louisa asked. Adrian considered another potato. The hour before dinner. Candles lit, the whole house smelling of the kitchen, and everyone trying to behave. "And yours?" "Breakfast," said Louisa. Not because it was splendid, only because there was time to linger over it. Adrian looked toward the next room, where the silver was mismatched, the ribbon reused, and the holly beginning to wilt bravely above the mantel. "Our breakfast this morning lacked something of that ease," he said. "Yes," said Louisa, though it had more activity and stronger opinions. "Much stronger." Their eyes met for a moment. Mrs. Wilmot came back at exactly that instant and looked from one to the other. "If either of you has time for memories, you have time for onions." She dropped 3 onto the table. Adrian looked at them cautiously. "Must they all be addressed?" "Yes, my lord, and if you make a tragedy of it, do it quietly." He picked one up. "Miss Hartwell, have you any Christmas tradition relating to onions?" "None that ended happily." Louisa handed him the knife. "Smaller than the potatoes. Onions require more respect." From the passage, Felix called, "I would dine in reduced circumstances with enthusiasm if dinner appeared before dark." "Then earn it," said Mrs. Wilmot. Louisa took up the bowl of potatoes and moved toward the range. Adrian followed with the onions and set them down where she pointed, without asking whether he was in the way. That, she thought, was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. He no longer seemed merely willing to help. He had begun to fit himself into the work. Not gracefully, exactly, but without fuss, and with a good temper she would never have expected from him in the carriage. The Christmas they had expected had never appeared. This one, against all sense, was being made by hand. Chapter 5. The Christmas Dinner. By late afternoon, Briar had begun to smell like Christmas, whether the house approved of it or not. The kitchen windows were clouded with steam. Cloves, nutmeg, onion, and roasting meat had entered the air together and improved it so much that even the passage outside felt more hopeful. Mrs. Wilmot stood in the middle of it with the look of a woman granting concessions under protest. "I am not promising a feast," Mrs. Wilmot said. "I am promising dinner. If people insist on calling it Christmas, that is their affair." "It smells very like Christmas," said Felix, appearing in the doorway with a basket he had plainly forgotten to put down. "It smells like work," Mrs. Wilmot said. "If you are not bringing something useful, remove yourself." Felix looked into the basket. "I have vegetables." "Then for once you may stay." Louisa, polishing spoons at the long table, had to turn away for a moment. Across from her, Augusta folded napkins with stern precision. Weatherby arrived with polished candlesticks and set them down as if they were crown jewels. "If we are to dine in difficulty," Weatherby said, "we need not do so in darkness." Felix sighed. "Weatherby, you are the soul of the season." "I am the butler, sir," said Weatherby. Colonel Ford came in behind him with wood and a bottle from the cellar. Adrian followed with a blue-rimmed dish in his hands, his sleeves turned back, his hair less orderly than it had been that morning. It suited him unfairly well. Mrs. Wilmot looked up. "My lord, if that dish belongs on the table, I do not know why it is still in your hands." "I was admiring its character," Adrian said. "You were delaying dinner," said Mrs. Wilmot. He set it down at once. Louisa polished another spoon. "You improve under command." Adrian glanced at her. "I begin to suspect it is my hidden gift." "Your hidden gift," Louisa said, "is getting coal on your coat with unusual elegance. That is less a gift than a style." She smiled despite herself. On the range, something hissed. Mrs. Wilmot lifted a lid, and steam rushed up. Felix had meanwhile discovered the bottle. "If we are to have Christmas dinner," he said, "we ought to have Christmas punch." Weatherby turned his head slowly. "Not if you mean to make it, sir." "I have every instinct for it." "That," said Augusta, "is not the same as knowledge." Felix ignored her. "There is wine. There are spices. There is sugar. I see no obstacle except tyranny." "The obstacle," Mrs. Wilmot said, "is you." Arabella came in then, neat again in a softer blue gown, and stopped in the doorway. "I was told something delicious was happening," Arabella said. "Something useful," said Mrs. Wilmot. Arabella glanced toward the work table where onions were waiting to be chopped. "Must there be so many onions in Christmas?" "There must at Briar," Mrs. Wilmot said. "We cannot all live on sugar and expectation." Even Colonel Ford looked faintly amused. Arabella drifted toward the silver and candles. "It does look better," she said, almost unwillingly. "It does," Louisa said. The pause that followed was not exactly friendly, but it was no longer sharp. Adrian took up a peeler. "This is the sound of Miss Sutton maturing before our eyes." "Do not be absurd," Arabella said. "I am preserving standards." "Then preserve them in the drawing-room," said Mrs. Wilmot. "Miss Hartwell, help Mr. Weatherby with the table. Colonel Ford, another basket of logs. Mr. Harcourt, if you are still dreaming of punch, you may grate nutmeg where I can see you." Felix brightened at once. "Madam, you restore my happiness." "I restore nothing," said Mrs. Wilmot. "I only mean to keep you under observation." Louisa gathered the spoons and followed Weatherby into the passage. Behind her came warmth, spice, and Felix saying with dangerous confidence, "How difficult can punch be?" The kitchen alliance began, as many important alliances do, with something in danger of burning. Louisa had barely returned when Mrs. Wilmot thrust a spoon into her hand and pointed toward a shallow pan near the back of the range. "Stir that," Mrs. Wilmot said, "and if it catches fire, I shall blame the company in general and Lord Adrian in particular." Adrian, whose campaign against the potatoes had occupied a respectable portion of the afternoon and left him rather too pleased with himself, said, "I accept the risk, though not the justice." "That," said Mrs. Wilmot, "is because you have not yet seen the pan." Louisa stepped to the range at once. Butter, onion and cream had reached the dangerous point between promising and ruined. She stirred quickly. Adrian came beside her. "What is it?" Adrian asked. "At present, uncertain," Louisa said. "If left another minute, regret." "Can it be saved?" "Yes," Louisa said, "if you stop speaking and hand me that jug." He did so at once, correctly, and without flourish. Louisa looked at him. "You see," Adrian said quietly. "I am becoming formidable." "You are becoming trainable," Louisa said. He smiled. The pan hissed, then settled. Mrs. Wilmot glanced over. "Very well, it may live." At that moment Felix appeared in the doorway with a grater in one hand and a bowl in the other. "I believe the punch requires tasting," Felix said. "The punch," said Weatherby behind him, "requires restraint." "It also requires orange," Felix said. "It requires mercy," said Augusta, coming in after him. Colonel Ford took the bowl, looked into it, and said, "This would discourage a regiment." Felix looked wounded. It is a first attempt. It should also be the last, Augusta said. Mrs. Wilmot did not turn round. Dilute it, then keep Mr. Harcourt from improving it further. Adrian picked up a knife and reached for the apples. What am I fit for now? Those, perhaps, Louisa said. If you can be trusted with fruit. That sounds less like confidence than challenge. It is challenge. He sat down and began. His first attempt took off too much peel. The second was better. By the third, he had the air of a man determined not to be defeated by anything round and seasonal. The kitchen had grown warmer with every quarter hour. Steam blurred the panes. The fowl was browning properly. From the drawing room came the faint clink of glass as Weatherby laid the table. Adrian had improved enough with the apples to become careful rather than destructive. Louisa handed him the dish. That one may be called respectable. High praise, Adrian said. Do not grow vain on it. Too late. He looked down at the slices. I had not expected Christmas at Briar to depend so much upon my character. At present, Louisa said, it depends chiefly on your not ruining the fruit. At the range, the pan gave a sudden spit. Louisa turned at once. Oh no! She reached for it, but Adrian was nearer. He caught the handle with the cloth and pulled it off the fiercest heat. Have I saved it? Adrian asked, or only moved the catastrophe? Louisa looked into the pan. One edge had darkened, but not beyond hope. Saved, she said. Just. He set it down carefully. Then I begin to see the thrill of domestic life. There is no thrill, said Mrs. Wilmot, only timing. Louisa laughed then, properly and without restraint. Adrian turned his head at once. What is it? Louisa asked. Only that Briar has produced a surprising amount of improvement in one day. In the dinner? In my prospects, Adrian said. She looked at him. Your prospects? With you, he said lightly, though not lightly enough. This morning I was merely tolerated. Now I have helped rescue a source. Louisa tried for severity and felt it slipping. You have also injured several potatoes. I am willing to be judged as a whole. Mrs. Wilmot came between them, tasted the pan and pronounced, acceptable. From the passage Felix called, The punch improves! So does poison, Augusta called back. Louisa carried the bread to the sideboard. Adrian brought the apples after her, and this time when she pointed, he set them down exactly where they were wanted. He was trying, not because he cared about apples or sauce, but because she was there, and because her good opinion had somehow become important to him. Outside, the snow still pressed at the windows. Inside, dinner drew nearer by degrees. Made not grandly but stubbornly. By heat, work, spice, and good temper. By the time Weatherby announced dinner, the whole house had the look of something rescued at the last moment and made presentable by force of will. The drawing room had been transformed as far as Briar allowed. Candles burned in the polished sticks. The better china stood ready on the cloth. The silver, though mismatched, had been rubbed into brightness by labour rather than luxury. Holly still leaned above the mantel, but with enough confidence now to look intentional. The company entered with the subdued air of people who had spent all day earning the right to sit down. Lady Honoria arrived first and accepted her chair near the fire, as if it were an apology from fate. Arabella followed in blue silk, very pretty, faintly peevish, and too hungry to sustain full indignation. Felix came in, carrying the punch bowl under Weatherby's supervision, and looking as proud as if he had conquered Spain. Augusta looked composed. Colonel Ford held back to let the others pass, then took his place with the quietness of a man who knew a fire and a chair for blessings. Adrian came last, delayed by Weatherby over the carrying of a dish that clearly ought not to be trusted to anyone cheerful. When he took his seat across from Louisa, he looked tired, warmed through, and entirely unlike the neat gentleman who had smiled at her in the carriage. A day of being useful had settled him into himself. Weatherby uncovered the first dish with grave ceremony. It was not a grand Christmas dinner, but it was a real one. The roast fowl had browned properly. The potatoes, despite Adrian's earlier liberties with them, had recovered their dignity. There was hot gravy, Brussels sprouts, onions cooked soft and fragrant, bread still warm, and the faint scent of cloves and nutmeg rising from the pudding still to come. For a moment no one spoke. Then Lady Honoria said, with softened astonishment, "Well!" Mrs. Wilmot, standing in the doorway with her arms folded inside her apron, said, "That is dinner, my lady. You need not trust it, only eat it." That, at least, everyone was prepared to do. The first few minutes were given over to the honourable quiet of hungry people, discovering that what they had worked toward was not only edible but good. Across the table, Adrian tasted the potatoes and gave the smallest nod in Louisa's direction. "You are not to congratulate yourself," Louisa said softly. "I saved those." "I was congratulating you," Adrian said. "That is wiser." Felix looked round the table with satisfaction. "You see? We have achieved Christmas after all." "We have achieved dinner," Augusta said. "At Christmas," said Felix. "That does not improve your logic." "It improves my mood." "That is more easily managed," said Colonel Ford. Augusta glanced at him then, only briefly, but Louisa saw it. At length Felix, unable to endure suspense, ladled out the punch. Lady Honoria took one sip and paused. Arabella looked alarmed. "Is it dreadful?" "No," said Lady Honoria slowly. "It is merely confused." Felix looked wounded. "It has orange." "That," Augusta said, "was never in question." Colonel Ford drank his own portion with composure. "It improves on acquaintance." "That is the kindest thing anyone has yet said of it," Felix replied. Mrs. Wilmot entered then with the pudding, and even Lady Honoria gave a small sound of revived feeling. It was not large, but it was handsome. Steam rose from it faintly, spice drifted ahead of it like memory, and the cream beside it made the whole table look better provided for than it had any right to be. This dinner had not arrived on silver feet. It had been coaxed, stirred, corrected, diluted, and nearly burned into being. Mrs. Wilmot set it down. "There. If anyone finds fault with that, he may boil his own next year." "No one will," Adrian said. They tasted it. It was good. Warm, rich, fragrant, and exactly what the day had wanted from the beginning. Felix closed his eyes in approval. Arabella surrendered entirely to pleasure. "I shall not complain again this evening," she said. Mrs. Wilmot, from the sideboard, replied, "Then Christmas has indeed performed a wonder." Even Lady Honoria laughed at that. Louisa sat with her spoon in her hand and looked round the table. Felix's cuff still bore a trace of nutmeg. Adrian had soot at one sleeve. Augusta's hair had loosened a little at the temples. Arabella was still decorative and unmistakably on her second helping. Lady Honoria was fed, which improved her temper and made her look almost benevolent. Louisa was glad to learn later that Tommy, Dawson, and the coachman had had their own Christmas dinner in the kitchen, with gravy, pudding, and a ladleful each of Felix's questionable punch. Tommy had thought it grand, Dawson had thought it warming, and the coachman, who had spent the day among horses and frozen harness, had thought any punch at all a Christmas mercy. Nothing was grand. Everything was enough. This, Louisa thought, had become the true Christmas feast of the day. Not the imagined dinner at Wintermere, but this one, made by hand and shared in good faith. Across the table, Adrian lifted his glass slightly. Not enough to draw notice, only enough that she could not mistake the little private acknowledgement. After the smallest pause, Louisa lifted hers in return. No one noticed. Which was just as well. Chapter 6. Christmas by Candlelight. After dinner, Briar became almost gentle. The worst of the labour was done. The fires were steady, the candles lit, and the drawing room, though modest still, had acquired enough warmth, polish, and holly to suggest that Christmas had, against expectation, decided to remain. Lady Honoria had drawn her chair nearer the fire, and entered that state of comfort in which she became almost handsome again. Arabella, softened by dinner and blue silk, looked much less inclined to quarrel with the century. Felix sprawled where he ought not. Augusta had taken up a little piece of mending. Colonel Ford sat near the lamp with the grave ease of a man who knew how to be quiet without making silence oppressive. Weatherby entered carrying a tray. At one end of it stood a bottle which had plainly been chosen with feeling. There were also mince pies. Felix saw them first. "Weatherby," he said, sitting up at once, "you have found hope." Weatherby set the tray down with due care. "I have found, sir, that if Christmas is to be observed at Briar, it must be done with what resources remain loyal." Lady Honoria lifted her brows. "You kept back wine?" "I preserved wine, my lady." "That," said Adrian, taking a glass, "is a distinction on which civilization depends." Weatherby inclined his head, which from him was very nearly hilarity. Felix bit into a mince pie with reverence. "I begin to think adversity has its points." "Only when it is ending," said Augusta. Louisa had taken a chair a little apart from the fire. From there, she could see the room as a whole. The holly still leaned a little over the mantel, but now it looked companionable rather than makeshift. Outside the curtains, the snow no longer seemed like an enemy. It had become instead the white wall around their small and improbable Christmas. Felix, swallowing his first pie almost too fast to count as gratitude, said, "Now all we require is music." Arabella sighed. "There was to have been music at Wintermere." "There is very likely music there still," said Adrian, "though I cannot help thinking we should have heard less of one another in it." "That," said Louisa before she meant to, "would have been a loss." Adrian looked at her across the candlelit room, and for a moment the whole house seemed quieter. Then Felix said, "Miss Hartwell, do you play?" "A little," Louisa said. "There is a pianoforte in the morning room," said Weatherby, as if producing the fact from a locked compartment of his soul. "Then it shall be used now," said Felix, rising with rash enthusiasm. Mrs. Wilmot appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Harcourt, if you put your hands on that instrument before Miss Hartwell does, I shall have them removed." Felix sat down again at once. Christmas at Briar had not improved by becoming finer. It had improved because no one was trying so hard anymore. The pianoforte in the morning room had gone slightly out of tune, but then so, Louisa thought, had the whole day, and no one seemed inclined to object on principle. Weatherby lit 2 candles for her. The instrument stood near the window, its dark wood a little dulled by disuse, but the keys answered well enough once she sat down and tried them. "I warn you," Louisa said, looking over her shoulder, "that Briar is not equal to brilliance." Felix, who had followed with a second mince pie and every confidence in other people's talents, said, "We ask only survival." "That," said Augusta, taking a chair near the door, "has been the standard all day." So Louisa played something simple, an old Christmas air known in most houses and easy enough to carry through a room without demanding too much of it. The notes were not perfect. One key answered late, yet by the end of the first piece, the room had settled around the music as if it had been waiting for it all day. She played another, then stopped. Felix said, in unusual stillness, "I shall forgive Briar almost anything now." "You will forgive it much sooner than it deserves," said Augusta. Lady Honoria opened her eyes. "Miss Hartwell, that was very pretty, much better than I expected from the instrument." Louisa smiled. "Then I shall accept it as praise." There was laughter, soft and easy. It was Felix who insisted they must sing, as if Christmas itself would take offence otherwise. Lady Honoria refused immediately. Arabella said the pianoforte was unequal to the task. Augusta looked as though she had been expecting the suggestion and had already forgiven it. Yet once Louisa began a familiar carol, Felix joined in with fearless inaccuracy, Arabella with delicate reluctance, and Lady Honoria, after maintaining silence through the opening lines, entered with the unmistakable air of a woman correcting the room by example. Colonel Ford sang in a low voice, Adrian in one lower still, and though the result would never have survived a critical audience, it suited Briar perfectly. Felix, who could never leave quiet alone for long, said, "Well then, before we all grow too reflective, someone must tell a Christmas story." "No stories," said Lady Honoria at once. "Then a story is plainly required," Adrian said. Felix pointed at him. "Excellent. Then you shall begin." Adrian settled back in his chair. "Very well. Mine involve a plum pudding set alight too early, my grandmother declaring the servants had lost all moral grip, and my brother refusing, at the age of 10, to eat anything blue." "Why blue?" Arabella laughed. He had been told the flames were blue because of the brandy and concluded the colour had entered the pudding. Felix said, "That is reasoning I respect." Louisa smiled. "And did no one correct him?" "My grandmother did." "He remained unconvinced for 3 years." Felix turned at once. "Miss Hartwell, yours?" Louisa had not meant to speak much, but the room had grown so warm that reserve began to feel almost affected. "At home," she said. "Christmas was never very grand. My father disliked noise before noon, and my mother thought people decorated too much out of panic. We had one bowl of greenery in the hall, the same silver dishes every year, and a fire in the dining room so large that no one could sit on one side of the table for fear of roasting. By evening, everyone was tired but pleased." Adrian said quietly, "Those are usually the happiest houses." Before Louisa could answer, Augusta said, "My aunt once insisted upon a 12th night game so elaborate that 2 cousins stopped speaking and an elderly rector lost his dignity under a paper crown." Felix sat up. "Miss Penrith, I had not thought you capable of such a story. I was not the one in the crown." "That is a great disappointment." It was a greater one to the rector. Even Colonel Ford smiled at that. Felix, scenting success, turned to him. "Colonel, yours." Colonel Ford took a moment. "Mine are less domestic, but I remember my mother always insisting that the servants' hall should have the same pudding as the dining room, however much my father objected to the expense. Since then I have spent Christmas in camps, inns, borrowed lodgings, and once in a farmhouse where the goose was stolen by a dog before dinner." Felix stared. "That is the most tragic thing I have ever heard." "It was," said Colonel Ford, "a hungry district." Augusta, who had set down her mending without noticing it, asked, "And what do you miss most?" Colonel Ford looked at her. The sound of a house expecting people. Doors opening, fires already lit, someone in the kitchen certain of dinner. "Yes," Augusta said, "that is exactly it." No one interrupted. At length Arabella said from the sofa, "I miss not being cold." Lady Honoria said, "My dear, everyone has noticed." "They ought then to sympathise," Arabella said. "They do," said Adrian. "Some of us are only trying not to make a speech of it." Arabella gave him a look. "You improve in adversity and become pleased with yourself." "I improve," Adrian said, "because Miss Hartwell laughs when I am corrected." Louisa turned too quickly. "That is not true." "It is entirely true," said Adrian. Felix looked delighted. "Then we are all indebted to Miss Hartwell for the progress of the male character." Augusta took up her mending again. "Speak for yourself." "Some men remain experimental." The talk moved on after that, easier and gentler. Nothing very grand was said. Nothing needed to be. The room itself had become the point. Warm, imperfect, and lit against the snow. As the evening wore on, the room grew quieter, without ever becoming dull. The fire had settled into a deep red glow. Arabella had begun to yawn. Lady Honoria, fed, warmed, and softened by wine, had ceased to find fault with the century for nearly 10 minutes at a time. Weatherby entered carrying a small tray. Upon it stood a squat silver pot and a row of cups. "What have you there?" Felix asked hopefully. "Negus, sir," said Weatherby. Mrs. Wilmot found spices and decided the day might end more kindly than it began. He poured with grave precision. The smell rose at once, orange peel, clove, and warmed wine. Adrian took one of the cups and crossed the room with it. Louisa, who had not realized until that moment how tired she was, looked up as he stopped beside her chair. "You are half asleep," Adrian said quietly. "I am not." You blinked very slowly at the fire. That was reflection. It was surrender. He held out the cup. "Take this before Weatherby decides you are unworthy of it." Louisa accepted it. "Thank you." He sat down in the chair beside hers, though not so near as to make the choice obvious to anyone but herself. Louisa tasted the drink. "Oh." Adrian glanced at her. "Is that approval?" "It is surprise." Then Briar continues to exceed all reasonable expectation. For a minute or two, they said nothing. They did not need to. The room itself spoke well enough. The fire, the murmur of voices, the wind muffled behind curtains and old walls. Then Felix, mistaking every lull for an invitation, said, "Someone ought to read." "No one ought," said Augusta. "Then let it be someone with a tolerable voice," said Lady Honoria. Felix looked wounded. "I have a very tolerable voice." "You have 3, said Augusta. "That is the trouble." Adrian set down his cup. "If a book must be inflicted on the room, I will spare it, Mr. Harcourt." Weatherby, with the air of a man who had anticipated and disapproved of this from the beginning, produced a worn volume of Christmas readings from the side table. Adrian took it and opened to a place as though he had not chosen the role but was prepared to perform it properly now it had found him. Adrian took it and read. He did it simply, without display, and because of that, every word seemed easier to hear. Even Lady Honoria listened without interruption. Arabella stopped fidgeting. Felix made a respectable attempt at stillness. Colonel Ford remained by the mantel, quiet and attentive. Augusta had folded away her mending. Louisa watched Adrian over the edge of her cup. He looked less polished like this, perhaps, if polish meant easy effect. He looked better, kinder, more real. She had thought him merely smooth on the road. She saw now that the polish had concealed something better than vanity. It had concealed patience. And patience, she could not help thinking, wore unusually well by candlelight. When he finished, Felix drew in a theatrical breath. "There, I shall forgive Christmas nearly everything." "You have forgiven it too much already," said Augusta. Lady Honoria said, "No, Mr. Harcourt is right for once. That was extremely tolerable." "High praise," Adrian murmured. "It is all you are receiving," she said. A little later, Lady Honoria declared the hour unreasonable. Arabella agreed, and the room began to loosen at the edges. Chairs moved, cups were gathered, Felix yawned without shame. Weatherby returned to his tray with the patient air of a man collecting proof that the evening had occurred. Louisa rose too, though slowly enough that Adrian noticed. "You are tired," he said. "So is everyone." "Indeed," Adrian said, taking her empty cup from her hand before she could protest. "But everyone is not trying to pretend otherwise." The remark was too quiet to be teased, and too gentle to resist. Beyond the windows, the snow still lay thick over the world. Inside, Briar was warm, lit, and full of the last traces of Christmas. The holiday had ceased, without her quite seeing when it happened, to feel like something they had lost. It had come to them after all. Chapter 7. Boxing Day. At Briar, the day began more quietly. Christmas had not entirely gone. It remained in the holly above the mantel, in the ribbon still tied round the candlestick, and in the faint spice that lingered in the drawing-room as though the pudding had left behind a memory of itself. But the excitement was spent. The house no longer felt festive so much as lived in. Louisa, coming downstairs, thought that was a different sort of comfort. In the drawing-room, Augusta was already seated near the window with a cup in her hand and a look of morning composure that suggested she had risen, dressed, and formed an opinion of the day before anyone else had properly opened an eye. "Good morning," Louisa said. Augusta looked up. "That depends. Have they found breakfast yet?" Louisa smiled. I smell toast. Then the morning has possibilities, said Augusta. From the passage came Felix's cheerful voice. I maintain, he was saying, that if one survives Christmas in a snowbound house, one ought to receive a medal. You may have porridge, said Mrs. Wilmot. You are more likely to get that. Felix entered a moment later, hair imperfect, neckcloth worse, and spirit untouched by either. There, he said, looking round with approval. We are becoming rustic. We are becoming untidy, said Augusta. That is only rusticity seen from the wrong point of view, said Felix. Weatherby appeared with a fresh dish of toast. He paused, took in Felix's appearance, and seemed to suffer inwardly. Good morning, sir, he said. Is it? Weatherby set down the dish. It has toast. Felix bowed. Then I withdraw the question. A little later, Colonel Ford came in from outside with frost at the shoulders of his coat. Well, Felix asked, are we abandoned forever? Not forever, said Colonel Ford. Another day, perhaps less. Felix looked pleased. Augusta looked thoughtful. Louisa felt the slightest turn somewhere within her. Not relief exactly, and not disappointment either, but the beginning of something quieter than either. Adrian entered a moment later. He glanced round at the toast, the tea, and the lingering signs of yesterday. I see the house has relented, Adrian said. Do not grow vain, said Augusta. It is only feeding you. That, Adrian said, taking the chair opposite Louisa, is how vanity begins. From above, Lady Honoria rang for assistance with the confidence of a woman who had learned nothing at all from the previous day. The Christmas glow remained, but softened now into habit. What had been made in haste and difficulty yesterday had settled overnight into ease. The holiday, Louisa thought, had stopped trying to impress them. It had become part of the house. After breakfast, Mrs. Wilmot decided that the house, having survived Christmas, must now be restored to reason. Colonel Ford, she said, appearing in the doorway with a basket on one arm. There are blankets and towels in the back store that belong upstairs. Miss Penrith, the linen press has been opened half the day for comforts and put back in a deplorable state. Mrs. Wilmot put the keys into Augusta's hand. Between you, you may perhaps restore one end of the house before evening. Felix looked up hopefully. And I? Mrs. Wilmot gave him a brief glance. You may begin with yesterday's dishes and try not to turn any more of them into history. Felix rose under protest. A moment later, his voice came from the kitchen in tones of disbelief. Did we dine or entertain Parliament? You may count the plates while washing them, said Mrs. Wilmot. It will keep your mind from invention. There appear to be dozens, Felix said mournfully. There were courses, said Mrs. Wilmot. I begin to think Christmas is largely made of dishes, Felix lamented. Then Boxing Day may improve your understanding of it, said Mrs. Wilmot dryly. A moment later, there came the unmistakable sound of a plate being handled too hastily. Mr. Harcourt, said Mrs. Wilmot, in a voice that carried through 2 doors and a passage. If you break that, you may eat your porridge from the basin. Augusta set down her cup. Very well. Colonel Ford rose without comment, and together they disappeared into the passage. She with a ring of keys, he with the basket and the air of a man prepared to carry whatever the house thought fit to burden him with. The linen press proved to be on the upper floor, tucked into a narrow passage that had not expected company and still objected to it. Augusta unlocked the door and stood a moment looking in. The shelves had once been perfect. What had altered them was human occupation. A blanket had been thrust back upon the wrong shelf. A pair of pillowcases lay in confusion. Someone, almost certainly Felix, had set a candlestick among the sheets. Augusta removed it with disapproval. Mr. Harcourt has the instincts of a cheerful invader. He means well, said Colonel Ford. Yes, said Augusta. That is why he is so exhausting. She began restoring order with calm, practiced hands. Colonel Ford watched a moment, then picked up the displaced blankets and held them while she reached the upper shelf. You have done this before, he said. Fold linen? No. Put houses back together after other people have moved through them. Augusta did not answer at once. At one time or another, she said. Most women do. She reached for another bundle and found it heavier than she expected. Colonel Ford took it from her at once. You need not do that, she said. No, he answered, but I can. He set the bundle where she pointed. There is a kind of war, he went on, which leaves mud in halls, boots in the wrong places, and everyone surprised that blankets are required. I have seen versions of it before. Augusta laughed softly. Then Briar must seem a minor campaign. It is better managed. That is because Mrs. Wilmot would not permit retreat. He glanced at her. She is considerably less intimidating than Miss Sutton. Arabella. She complains with invention, said Colonel Ford. One does not know where the next attack will land. That, Augusta said, is because she has never been contradicted enough to develop principles. He looked at her again. You are fond of her. She is a trial, Augusta said, and I am fond of her. Both things are true. That might have ended it, but it did not. You take a great deal of trouble for people, he said at last. She looked up. Do I? I have been watching, he admitted. That was not, she thought, the sort of thing one ought to say in a linen press on Boxing Day morning. You make it sound like surveillance. It is observation, said Colonel Ford. A military habit. One notices who keeps things going. At Briar, that would be Mrs. Wilmot. Mrs. Wilmot keeps the house going, he said. You keep the peace. That silenced her more effectively than flattery would have done, because there was no flattery in it at all. At that moment, Tommy appeared with an armful of half-dry towels, the pile swaying perilously as he advanced, and the expression of a child certain that whichever grown person noticed him first would find fault. Not all at once, Augusta said. Unless your ambition is to carpet the floor with linen. Tommy stopped as if turned to stone. Colonel Ford took the bundle from him before disaster could make its entrance. I have always found surrender preferable to collapse. Augusta put a hand to one of the towels and frowned. These are still damp. Tommy looked stricken. Mrs. Wilmot said if I left them by the stove again, they'd smell of onions. She is perfectly right, said Augusta. Then, softening a little at his face, she added, Go back and tell her I said they may hang in the south room. I will bear the blame. Tommy brightened at once and vanished with the speed of the reprieved. Colonel Ford, still holding the towels, said, You are softer than you pretend. Augusta took one from him and felt the damp still in it. And you observe too much. It has advantages, he replied. For whom? For me, generally. That made her laugh again. When the shelves were restored, the towels hung up again, and the press locked, they went downstairs together. Colonel Ford taking the basket because he had never once offered it back, and Augusta, to her own surprise, had not asked. At the turn of the stair, Lady Honoria's bell rang from above. Augusta closed her eyes briefly. There, you see, peace never lasts. Colonel Ford glanced at her. No, he said, but you restore it better than most. It was an absurd thing, perhaps, that such a simple remark should stay with her all the way down to the hall, yet it did. Arabella's humiliation began with a tray. As Weatherby was detained by Silver and Mrs. Wilmot by something boiling over, the tray was briefly without an owner. That was how Arabella came to be given it. You need only take your aunt her tea, said Augusta. Arabella looked at the tray as though it contained infection. Why me? Because, said Augusta, she is your aunt. That is not a qualification. It is today. At that moment, Felix appeared in the kitchen doorway with his sleeves rolled up and his arms wet to the elbows. If Miss Sutton would prefer my post, he said, I am perfectly willing to exchange. Arabella looked at him, then at the suds still clinging to his forearms, and drew herself up. I would rather perish on the stairs. Courage, then, said Felix. It is only tea, toast, and family duty. Which, said Augusta, is more than you have managed all morning. Take the tray, Arabella. That settled it. She took the tray. To give her credit, she did not immediately fail. She carried it out of the drawing room with considerable dignity. Louisa, who had followed as far as the hall with a basket of folded napkins, paused near the stairs to watch. The trouble began at the turn of the landing, where one of Felix's boots, removed earlier from the hall, had reappeared by a process no one understood and no one would admit to governing. Arabella did not see it until the toe of her slipper found it. She did not fall, but the tray tilted, the cups slid, the hot water escaped the jug in one disastrous silver arc, and the toast flew off the plate and landed at the very feet of Colonel Ford, who had just come out of the back passage carrying another basket of wood. There was a moment of perfect stillness. Arabella stood halfway up the stairs, one hand clutching the rail, the empty tray in her other hand, and looked as if she had been personally betrayed by architecture. Colonel Ford looked down at the toast, then at the boot, then up at Arabella. Felix arrived in time to see the whole scene, and had to lean against the banister for support. From above came Lady Honoria's voice. "What has happened, and is my tea safe?" Arabella shut her eyes. "Nothing has happened," she said, with the concentrated desperation of a woman surrounded by evidence to the contrary. Mrs. Wilmot came out of the passage at once. Her glance took in the boot, the tray, the toast, Colonel Ford, and Arabella in one sweep. "Mr. Harcourt," she said, "if that is your boot, I shall nail the other one to it." Felix, still bent double with suppressed laughter, managed, "It may be." "Then it may be buried." Colonel Ford set down the wood, picked up the fallen plate, gathered the toast, and rescued what remained of the tray from Arabella. "No lasting harm," he said. Arabella looked at him, scarlet. There was toast on the stairs. "Yes," said Colonel Ford, "but not on you, which is the better outcome." Augusta had come up by then. She took the tray from Colonel Ford and said in a tone of perfect composure, "Well, you see, you have now done something real for Christmas and Boxing Day both." Arabella stared at her. "I have upset breakfast." "You have carried it first," Augusta said. "That is already progress." Mrs. Wilmot stooped, lifted the boot by 2 fingers, and handed it to Felix with the expression of a woman returning evidence at trial. "If another article of your person appears where decent people walk," she said, "I shall put you out with it." Felix accepted the boot in meekness, which in him lasted almost 4 seconds. Louisa, who had set down the napkins to prevent herself from making matters worse by laughing, looked back toward Arabella and was surprised by what she saw there. Not only mortification, though there was plenty of that, something a shade different, a crack in the polished certainty with which Arabella usually met the world. She came down the last steps more slowly. "I suppose," Arabella said, with an effort at dignity, "that everyone may stop looking at me now." There was a pause. Arabella straightened. The colour was still high in her face, but something in it had changed. "I shall take her another tray," she said. Augusta looked at her. "Are you sure?" "No," said Arabella, "but I am apparently committed." Mrs. Wilmot, who had already retrieved the teapot and sent Tommy flying for fresh toast, gave one short nod. "Then wait." Within minutes, a second tray appeared. This time, Arabella took the tray with both hands and went upstairs in concentrated silence, pausing only once to steady the cups before disappearing around the turn. A moment later, Lady Honoria's voice sounded from above, softened by relief. "At last." Arabella came down again, empty-handed and pink, but not defeated. Felix, who had watched the whole ascent as if it were a military operation, said, "There, you see, triumph." Arabella gave him a look. "Do not make too much of it. I have only conveyed tea to my aunt, not preserved civilization." "At Briar," said Augusta, "the distinction grows smaller every hour." Then, in a much lower voice than usual, Arabella said, "I do not know how everyone does it." Louisa looked at her. "Does what?" "This." Arabella gestured vaguely toward the house, the trays, the passage, the whole untidy machinery of daily comfort. "Carrying things, laying things, remembering where they belong. It is exhausting." "It is," said Louisa. Arabella gave a short, unwilling laugh. And everyone else seems much better at it. Not Felix. That won a real smile, brief but unmistakable. Arabella looked up at the stair where the toast had fallen. I thought yesterday was absurd because it was Christmas. Today it is still absurd, and now I cannot blame the season. Only Briar, said Louisa. And myself, said Arabella. There was too much honesty in that to mock. Augusta, who had heard more than she let on, said as she turned back toward the drawing room, "A useful discovery, Arabella, is worth at least half a lesson." Arabella followed her, though with less bounce than usual. "I do not care for lessons." "No," said Augusta, "but they appear fond of you." Boxing Day had lost the little glitter Christmas still possessed, but in losing it had gained something else. The house was quieter now, truer somehow. No one expected enchantment. They had moved past performance and into the simpler business of getting through the day together with as much grace as could be managed. Arabella had at last taken one small step into that world. It did not suit her yet, but it had begun. Chapter 8. The Best of Briar. By Boxing Day afternoon, Briar had ceased to feel like a refuge and become, somehow, a little world. It was still imperfect. The blue room still admitted opinions from the weather. One stair creaked with personal feeling. The drawing-room rug had developed a corner that would not lie flat, and Felix had twice caught his heel in it, and now regarded the house with suspicion. Yet none of these things felt inconvenient in the old way. They had become part of Briar itself. Louisa stood for a moment at the drawing-room window. Beyond the curtains, there was only whiteness and the grey blur of afternoon fading into dusk. Indoors, however, there was movement enough to satisfy any house. From the kitchen passage came the clink of china and Felix asking whether mince pies improved by reheating. From somewhere above, Lady Honoria was calling for Arabella, who was plainly pretending not to hear. She turned back into the room. Augusta's mending basket sat near the lamp. A book lay open where Adrian had left it the night before. On the side table, beneath a folded napkin, stood a plate of leftover mince pies. Felix came in, lifted the napkin, and looked pleased with himself. "I have rescued these." "From what?" Augusta asked. "From neglect." "They were under a napkin." "That is neglect with linen," he replied. Colonel Ford came in next from the back hall, carrying a folded map of roads that no longer deserved the name. He took the chair nearest the fire. Arabella drifted in after him in pale lavender, a colour that treated her kindly and asked very little in return. "If you eat all of those before tea," she said to Felix, "I shall think even worse of you than I do now." He brightened. "How gratifying! I had not known I was still advancing." She snatched one pie before he could reach the plate again. From somewhere above came Lady Honoria's bell, followed a moment later by her voice calling for Arabella, who continued to look at the mince pies with the fixed composure of a woman hearing nothing at all. Felix glanced toward the ceiling. "I think you are wanted." "Then I am sorry for it," said Arabella. Lady Honoria entered a moment later, wrapped in a shawl and grievance, both of which suited her. She looked directly at Arabella. "I rang." Arabella turned with innocent surprise. "Did you, Aunt?" "Twice." "How unfortunate. The house must have swallowed the sound." "The house," said Lady Honoria, sitting down near the fire, "encourages untidiness." "No, Lady Honoria," said Felix. "It encourages comfort. Untidiness follows of itself." Weatherby entered with the tea tray before the debate could sharpen. Little cakes had appeared as well, smelling faintly of orange and spice. Felix saw them at once. "There," he said. "You see? Briar grows lavish." "Briar," said Weatherby, "grows accommodating. The distinction matters." Adrian came in at that moment and paused just inside the door, taking in the whole room at once. Louisa had grown too used to looking for him. That was becoming a problem. He glanced at the pie plate, at Colonel Ford by the fire, at Augusta's mending, at Arabella in lavender, and then at Louisa. "Well," he said, "it has the air of a household." "No," said Lady Honoria. "It has merely learned that we cannot yet be made to leave." Adrian took the chair beside Louisa's, not too near to provoke observation. He looked toward the holly above the mantel. "It is drying," he said. "So are we all," said Lady Honoria. He smiled and turned slightly toward Louisa, his voice lowered so that only she could hear. "It improves the room, I think. The holly, not Lady Honoria." "A distinction worth making," Louisa said. Tea was poured. The cakes disappeared with gratifying speed. The room settled again into ease. Mrs. Wilmot had already pronounced that the remains of Christmas dinner would do very well for supper, which lent tea a reckless air. Nothing about it should have been remarkable, and yet it was. Because no one had expected contentment here, least of all Louisa. The room thinned by degrees. Lady Honoria declared the hour unsuitable for lively company and withdrew with Arabella in attendance. Felix lasted a little longer, fortified by cake and his own conversation, then vanished upstairs after Weatherby informed him that yawning over the tea tray showed a want of breeding. Augusta carried off her mending. Colonel Ford followed more slowly, pausing only to put another log upon the fire. At last, the house settled. Louisa remained in the drawing-room, because she had told herself she meant only to put the cups in order and straighten the cloth on the side table. It was not a convincing excuse, but it would serve, until she heard the door open again and saw Adrian return from the passage with one of the candlesticks in his hand. "Have we been abandoned?" Adrian asked. "Only reduced," Louisa said. "That is often an improvement," he said. He set the candle on the table near her chair. The fire burned low but steady. The added light softened the panelling and threw the holly above the mantel into gentler shadow. Louisa folded a napkin once more, though it did not need it. "You ought to go upstairs." "So ought you." "Yes, but I was here first." He smiled and took the chair opposite. Then, after a moment, shifted to the one a little nearer the fire. "I do not think I have ever spent a Christmas like this," he said. "No?" No one at home would have permitted it. There would have been too much silver, too much certainty that everything ought to look cheerful whether or not anyone felt it. "And here," he said, "everything has looked exactly as it was. Inconvenient, smoky, underfunded, and entirely real." She laughed softly. "That is not a flattering speech for Briar." "It is the most flattering one I can make." The laughter faded, but not the ease of it. He leaned back, looking at the fire. "I had expected to endure these 3 days. And now I am in danger of liking them too well." The words were lightly said, and not lightly enough. She said, after a moment, "That is because the worst of it is over. I am not sure that is the reason." He looked at her then. Louisa had spent 2 days discovering that Adrian was kinder, steadier, and much easier to value than she had first supposed. It had not prepared her for the difficulty of being looked at quietly by a man who meant what he said. She set down her cup. "The house has improved," she said, because it was easier than saying anything true. "Yes," he said, "though not as much as my opinion of it. Briar will be gratified." "I was not speaking of Briar." That was dangerously plain. Louisa rose instead and moved toward the hearth. After a moment he rose too, but did not come too near. "This was to have been a very different Christmas," she said. "You were meant to be at Wintermere." "I was meant to be anywhere but peeling potatoes under Mrs. Wilmot's inspection." That won a smile. "And yet," he said more quietly, "I do not think I would exchange it." "For Wintermere?" "For anything I expected." The simplicity of it was what undid her. "Lord Adrian," she said, and stopped. He waited. At last she managed. "You say things too directly for a drawing-room." "Then it is fortunate," he said, glancing round at the worn carpet, the drying holly, and the chairs dragged from their proper places, "that this is Briar. She laughed again, though more quietly now. In the passage beyond the drawing room, a board creaked. The spell did not break, but it loosened enough for breath to return. Adrian stepped back first. "You are tired," he said. "So are you." "Yes," he answered, "but I find I dislike ending the day." "It has been a good one," Louisa said. "The best of Briar," he said quietly. She looked at him then, and because there was no safety in pretending not to understand, she said only, "Yes." He picked up the candlestick again and held it toward her. "May I at least light your way upstairs?" She hesitated only a moment before inclining her head. The passage upstairs was dim and very still. Adrian carried the candlestick a little ahead of them, and the light moved softly over the panelling and worn runner. The house had gone quiet at last. They stopped outside the south room. Adrian set the candlestick on the little table in the passage and turned toward her. For a moment neither moved. "Miss Hartwell." Only her name, but the way he said it made reply difficult. "Yes?" He rested one hand lightly on the table beside the candle. "I have been trying, for the better part of an hour, to think of a careful thing to say to you." Louisa's breath caught. "And have you found one?" "No." The honesty of it struck deeper than she was prepared for. He gave a small, almost rueful smile. "Everything careful sounds false. Briar appears to have spoiled me for ordinary conversation. That is a bold charge to lay against a house." "I am not laying it against the house." She looked at him then, fully. He was very near saying it. She knew that. He knew it too. "I ought not." He stopped. "Ought not what?" He laughed once under his breath. "You see how poor I have become at caution." She ought to have helped him then, turned it aside, given him room to retreat into good manners and a quiet good night. Instead, she stood where she was, one hand resting on the latch, and did none of those things. That is not always a fault. His expression changed at once. "Louisa." There it was, not a declaration, not yet, but no drawing-room politeness either. He took one step nearer, then stopped again, as if even now he would not come closer without leave. "I know very well how short a time it has been. I know also that snow, confusion, and Mrs. Wilmot's authority are not the usual foundation for good sense." That won the smallest smile from her. "That I should dislike leaving Briar with you thinking this has meant less to me than it has." The words were plain. That was what made them matter. Louisa looked down for one moment, then back at him. "It has not meant little to me." The silence after that was not empty. It was full to the brim. He drew breath as if to speak again. A second later came Lady Honoria's voice from farther down the passage, muffled by her door and rich with indignation. "There are decent people trying to sleep in this house." Louisa put one hand briefly over her mouth, and Adrian, after one incredulous look, laughed. Not loudly, not enough to wake the house, but openly and with such relief in it that she could not help laughing too. Adrian shook his head once. "Lady Honoria has a remarkable instinct for choosing her moment." She would call it excellent management. I have no doubt she would. At last Louisa lifted the latch. "Good night, Lord Adrian." He looked at her, and there was still too much in his face for safety. "Good night." After the smallest pause, he spoke again. "Do not let Briar persuade you that I am patient by nature. I am only trying very hard tonight." Louisa felt the warmth rise into her face before she could prevent it. "I believe you are." That was as near a victory as either of them could bear. She slipped into the room and closed the door softly behind her. Briar had become precious. There was no use pretending otherwise now. And whatever had taken root there, by candlelight, in disorder, after Christmas and just beyond confession, was now in earnest. Chapter 9. Snow's End. The change came so quietly that at first no one trusted it. On the morning after the best of Briar, Louisa woke to a silence unlike the others. The house was still, but not in the muffled, besieged way it had been since Christmas Eve. The storm no longer pressed at the walls. When she came downstairs, she found the front hall brighter, with a thin wash of sun upon the flagged floor. Weatherby stood just inside the front door. That alone was enough to alarm her. He turned as she came down the stairs. "Good morning, miss." "Something has happened?" Weatherby hesitated. "Something has changed." Before she could ask further, voices sounded outside. A moment later, Colonel Ford stepped in from the yard with snow upon his boots and 2 village men behind him, both red-faced from the morning. Colonel Ford took off his gloves. "The lane is being cleared." There it was. Not disaster. Not relief, something worse for pretending to be welcome. Felix, who had appeared in the passage in a state of incomplete neckcloth and immediate curiosity, said, "Cleared for whom?" "For anyone fool enough to travel it," said Colonel Ford. Mrs. Wilmot emerged from the back of the house. "Can it be done?" "One cart has come through from the village," Colonel Ford said. "Another may manage by afternoon if the light holds." Mrs. Wilmot nodded once. "Then there will be trunks, questions and confusion from one end of the house to the other," said Mrs. Wilmot, with the tone of a woman naming an illness. That brought the rest of them. Augusta came first, calm as ever. Arabella followed with sudden brightness. Lady Honoria appeared at the top of the stairs in a wrapper of magnificent discontent and demanded to know whether civilization had been recovered. Adrian came last. Louisa did not look at him at once. When she did, his expression had already settled into its usual ease, yet she saw, as she would not have seen 3 days ago, that he was listening more closely than he appeared. Lady Honoria, having received the news in full, said, "At last!" Arabella clasped her hands. "Then we may actually leave today?" "Or tomorrow," said Colonel Ford, "or not until the next day if the road changes its mind." Her face fell a little. Felix said, "This is excellent. I had begun to fear we should all grow old here." Mrs. Wilmot looked at him. "Some of us have not done it unassisted." Louisa, however, felt a distinct sinking somewhere under her ribs. The lane had to reopen. People could not live forever in suspended Christmas among drying holly and borrowed rooms. Yet the news fell upon her with the peculiar chill of something she had expected and still hoped, foolishly, to be spared. The little world they had made at Briar had not ended yet, but it had been given notice. Adrian moved at last from the stair into the hall. "So," he said, "the snow has grown tired of us." "No," said Mrs. Wilmot, "only tired of the road." One of the village men, cap in hand, said to Colonel Ford, "We'll know better by noon, sir. If it holds, there may be passage." If it holds. There was the whole matter in 3 words. Weatherby, who had listened with the grave face of a man receiving terms of surrender, said, "Then breakfast should not be delayed." That returned them, for a moment, to the business of the house. The news altered Briar at once. Nothing visible changed at first. The fires were still lit. The holly still hung above the mantel, though dry now at the edges. Yet through the house there ran a new current, thin but unmistakable. Lady Honoria received it as triumph. By the time Louisa came down to breakfast properly dressed, they were all at table. Adrian glanced at the dishes before him. "It is a sign of how far we have fallen that no one has yet asked whether the hens mean to lay again." "Perhaps we have learned resignation," Louisa said. "I have not," said Felix. "I still believe in eggs." "This has been very well," said Lady Honoria, "under the circumstances. But one cannot live forever in heroic inconvenience." Felix, buttering toast with great seriousness, said, "Why not? It improves conversation." "It ruins linen," said Lady Honoria. Arabella, beside her aunt, had regained a little of the brightness she had worn on the first day of the journey, though now it sat more like relief than expectation. "If we can go on," she said, "there may still be people at Wintermere." Felix looked up. "Do you think they have been preserved for us?" "At any rate, there will be proper company." "Have we not been proper?" Adrian asked. Arabella, who had grown just enough wiser not to answer too quickly, said, "Only in parts." "That," said Felix, "is all anyone may claim after 3 days snowbound." Augusta smiled faintly. Colonel Ford said almost nothing at all. Mrs. Wilmot came in with more toast and said, "If the gentlemen and ladies mean to discuss departure over every cup, they may at least eat while doing it." That checked them briefly. Louisa sat opposite Adrian and wished, for once, that she did not. The table gave him too many chances to glance up unexpectedly. It also gave her too many chances to discover that she knew now exactly what the quieter version of his expression meant. He was measuring time. He did not speak to her particularly. Neither did she speak to him. Yet all through the meal there ran between them the knowledge of the night before. The passage, the candlelight, the unfinished words. Adrian broke the silence at last, though not in any way that could be called private. "If we do go on," he said to Colonel Ford, "will the carriage survive it?" Colonel Ford looked at him. "The carriage may, Harcourt is less certain." Felix put a hand to his chest. "You speak as if I were luggage." "You are worse," said Augusta. "You comment." Colonel Ford smiled, but it passed quickly. After breakfast, the company scattered more quickly than on the days before. Lady Honoria went upstairs to direct packing as if armies had already been sighted. Arabella followed willingly. Mrs. Wilmot sent Felix to carry wood instead of inspecting the lane. He bore the disappointment with fortitude. Colonel Ford moved toward the door, paused, and asked Augusta, "Will you want your small valise brought down?" It was such a plain question that no one else would have heard anything beneath it. "Not yet," said Augusta. He nodded once and went out. When the door closed, Augusta looked for a moment not older, but more defenseless than Louisa had ever seen her. Then she smoothed her sleeve and became herself again. The room had emptied almost entirely before Louisa realized Adrian had not moved. He stood at the window, one hand in his pocket, looking out at the pale brightness beyond the glass. At length he turned. "The weather improves at very bad moments," he said. Louisa managed a small smile. "It is inconsiderate." "Extremely." That was all. Yet the quiet sadness of it stayed with her long after she left the room. By afternoon, Briar had begun to look at itself differently. Nothing had yet been packed into the carriages, and the lane was still uncertain. Yet the knowledge of departure had entered the house, and once admitted it altered everything. Louisa felt it first upstairs. The south room, made tolerable for 2 nights by firelight and shared conversation, now looked temporary again. Her gown for travel had been laid out. The little sprig of holly on the mantel had gone dry at the edges, and when she touched it, one leaf broke away under her finger. Christmas was over. It had gone by degrees, with folded shawls, cooling grates, and the quiet resolve to be ready if the road allowed it. Augusta was at the chest of drawers, sorting ribbons from gloves. "Do you think we shall go tomorrow?" Louisa asked. "Probably," said Augusta. "You say that as if it does not matter." Augusta gave her a look over one shoulder. "My dear Louisa, everything matters. Some things are simply less improved by announcing it." That was so exactly Augusta that Louisa said no more. A little later, she went downstairs, because the drawing-room had somehow become the centre of Briar in her mind. The afternoon light had faded early and left the room to the care of the fire. The ribbon still hung round the candlestick. The holly above the mantel had darkened at the edges. The plate that had held leftover mince pies now held only crumbs. Lady Honoria sat near the fire, directing Arabella's packing from below, having decided that stairs were beneath her, but authority was not. Arabella, summoned downstairs with the blue silk over one arm, wore a look of patient injury unusual in her. "No, the blue silk first." Lady Honoria was saying. One cannot arrive after such a delay looking as though one has been packed away with the bed linen. Aunt, if we do not arrive today, the blue silk will gain nothing from being crushed under the muslin. That is exactly the kind of sound practical sense I cannot endure in the young, said Lady Honoria. Arabella looked up and met Louisa's eye. For one instant, there was something in her face very near humour. Felix burst in from the passage with a quantity of snow on his boots. The lower drift is half gone, he announced. The whole county appears to be assaulting it with shovels and very poor temper. Mrs. Wilmot, appearing behind him, as if summoned by the snow itself, said, Then the whole county may leave its poor temper outside. Felix looked down. I have also brought in a little weather. You have brought in a field, said Mrs. Wilmot. Stand still until it melts in one place. He did so with heroic resignation. The door opened again. Adrian came in, cold in the face and damp at the hem of his coat. Lady Honoria asked at once whether they were rescued. Arabella wanted to know if the road would hold. Felix inquired whether any carriage had passed. Mrs. Wilmot asked whether the men had been fed. Only Louisa said nothing. Adrian answered them all as required, and because he did it lightly, no one but Louisa seemed to notice that his lightness had become an effort. At length the room emptied. Lady Honoria returned to the valise, Arabella to the ribbons. Mrs. Wilmot sent Felix to the kitchen to clean his boots and returned there herself. Louisa remained. So did Adrian. Weatherby entered at that moment with the candlesticks. He paused only long enough to take in the room, the unlit gloom, and the two of them standing too still in it. Will there be candles, Mr. Weatherby? Adrian asked. Weatherby moved toward the mantel with his usual grave authority. So long as the house is occupied, my lord, it will not sit in darkness. One by one, the candles were lit. Their flames rose, steadied, and gave back to Briar the familiar evening shape it had worn on Christmas. But now Louisa knew what that shape cost. For one more evening, Briar still held them. Chapter 10. What Briar Gave Them. Departure day began with tidying, which was far worse than any report from the lane. So long as Briar had remained in cheerful disorder, with chairs too near the fire, and trays appearing where no tray had any business, one might still pretend the thing could continue. But tidying belonged to endings. By breakfast time, the hall looked barer. Valises stood by the wall. Cloaks aired on chairs. The last of the holly had vanished from the drawing room. Even the house seemed to have remembered its standards. Felix was kneeling on a valise. It shut yesterday, he said darkly. Yesterday, said Augusta, fastening her glove. It contained fewer opinions. Lady Honoria sat by the fire, directing the packing of shawls she had not yet decided to wear. Arabella, in a dark blue travelling gown, stood at the window looking neat, pretty, and not entirely pleased with life. I do not see, said Lady Honoria, why departure requires so much folding. That, said Augusta, is because your ladyship has always had the excellent sense to leave such matters to other people. I have had the sense to leave them there. Weatherby came in with folded napkins and stopped at the sight of Felix still grappling with the valise. Mr. Harcourt, he said, if it will not close, the difficulty may lie in the arrangement. Felix got up at once. Then I handed over to science. Weatherby opened it, looked once inside, and said, Sir, you have packed your stockings upon your hairbrush. I was economizing space. You were insulting order. Louisa turned away at once, ostensibly to remove her gloves, though in truth it was to hide her laughter. Mrs. Wilmot came through from the back of the house with a basket on one arm, and the air of a woman who had been restoring civilization since dawn and found too much of it still mobile. If people mean to leave today, she said, they may begin by not shedding themselves about the furniture. No one is shedding, said Felix. Mrs. Wilmot picked up his scarf from a chair and handed it to him. Nothing that can be tripped over, she said, escapes notice. Lady Honoria rose with dignity and reluctance. I trust breakfast remains possible under these upheavals. My lady, I have fed you through Christmas and weather. I do not mean to fail on an ordinary morning merely because people have begun packing themselves off. From the passage came the sound of boots. Adrian entered carrying 2 logs, as though the household might yet collapse without him, and Colonel Ford followed with a bundle of luggage straps and the expression of a man who had already consulted the road and found it unreliably optimistic. Colonel Ford set the straps down. The lane may hold by noon. There, said Lady Honoria at once. We shall go. Possibly, said Colonel Ford. That is not the same thing, said Arabella. No, he answered, but it is the truest one available. Felix looked toward the window. I had not thought clear skies could produce so much packing. Only because it has produced luggage, said Augusta. And effort, said Felix. Breakfast appeared then, stronger and more orderly than on Christmas morning, as if Briar had decided that if it must send them away, it would at least do so correctly. There was toast, a dish of soft buttered eggs, porridge, and a plate of ham, which Lady Honoria received as though the house had at last apologized. Louisa sat down among them, and felt, with a distinct inward discomfort, that Briar had begun to take itself back. Perfectly reasonably. Abominably. After breakfast, Louisa meant to go upstairs at once and occupy herself with packing. It was a sensible intention, and would have done her credit if Adrian had not said behind her, Miss Hartwell. She turned. The passage was empty. Somewhere above, Lady Honoria was still directing shawls. Somewhere farther off, Felix was losing patience with leather. But here the house had given them one clear minute and stood back from it. Adrian had one hand on the back of a chair set out of the way. He looked composed at first glance. Louisa no longer trusted first glances. Before you go upstairs, he said, I must ask you to wait a moment. That sounds severe. It is only urgent. She let her hand fall from the stair rail. He led her no farther than the drawing-room hearth. The room looked barer already. The holly had gone. One chair had been restored to the wall. Yet it still held the shape of what it had been. Candlelit, untidy, and absurdly dear. For a moment he said nothing. Then, with a directness that left no room for ornament, he said, This was not the Christmas I expected. No, said Louisa. That much may be granted. I expected politeness, too much dinner, and a number of agreeable people saying pleasant things they did not mean. I did not expect weak tea, coal dust, Mrs. Wilmot, or potatoes. It might have made her smile if he had not continued at once. And yet it has been the dearest Christmas I have known. She did not answer. Not because of the weather, he said. Not because of the house, though I shall be fond of Briar to the end of my life. Because of you. The plainness of it struck deeper than elegance could have done. It was not the grand parts of these days that mattered. It was breakfast not appearing. It was hearing you laugh in the kitchen. It was watching you make sense of confusion as though the world ought naturally to be managed by intelligence instead of fuss. It was every room in the house improving when you were in it. Louisa looked down, only for a moment. I know what you may think, he said. That this is only Christmas and weather and a house cut off from the world making everything seem larger than it is. That had crossed my mind. I know. It crossed mine too, but when the road opened I did not want the feeling less. I wanted it more. He paused, then said, with complete clarity, I am not speaking because this has been charming. I am speaking because I choose you. There was no mistaking that. When we leave Briar, he said, I do not want to leave this behind as an agreeable accident. I want the life I liked best in it, the work, the laughter, the whole inconvenient business. If it is with you. She had needed one thing, and one thing only. You speak, she said, as though the world beyond Briar changes nothing. It changes the manner of it, he answered at once. It changes nothing of the matter itself. That was the sentence she had been waiting for. Not sentiment. Not gratitude. Choice. I did not know, she said quietly, whether you would think so still once the road opened. I feared you might think I would not. I did. That was unjust. That was prudent. He laughed, once with relief in it. And because there was nothing left but truth, Louisa said, I think I should have loved a colder, uglier house for the same reason. For one moment, he only looked at her. Then the warmth in his face was so sudden and so unguarded that she had to smile. Miss Hartwell, he said, that is the most encouraging speech ever made to a man. Do not look so pleased with yourself. I have earned a little of it. That made her laugh properly. Louisa, he said then, and now there was no distance left in either of them. When we leave Briar, will you allow me to speak to your father? Yes, she said. His smile changed altogether. Outside, in the yard, a wheel struck something hard, and someone called over the road. Then Felix's voice came from the passage. Has anyone seen my other glove? I warn the house that I am already out of humour and likely to become difficult. Adrian shut his eyes briefly. Louisa bit her lip. It appears, he said, that Mr. Harcourt has survived solely to prevent solemnity. It is a talent, said Louisa. He held out his hand. She gave him hers. Only for a moment, only long enough to make departure easier and much worse. There was the faintest movement at the door. Augusta, who had come back for the shawl she had left over a chair, saw enough at once and stopped. I beg your pardon, she said, with composure so exact that it was almost kindness. She took up the shawl and withdrew again at once, leaving behind a silence in which Louisa could feel her own face grow warm. Then she said, You had better recover yourself before the hall fills up. I had better recover myself before I speak to your father. That too. When they came back into the hall, Briar was in full motion. Not the anxious motion of a house under siege, but the brisk bustle of leaving. Rugs shaken, straps fastened, cases carried, and every object slowly returning either to its owner or its place. Augusta looked up from the folded shawl and took in Louisa's face at once. She said nothing, only lowered her eyes again with such exact understanding that Louisa was grateful to her beyond words. Felix, by contrast, had discovered only that his valise continued to resist him. This lock, he announced, kneeling on it again, has conceived a personal hatred. That, said Arabella, is because it knows you. Felix looked delighted. Miss Sutton, you improve. I am trying, said Arabella, and sounded, to Louisa's surprise, as though she meant it. Lady Honoria, already wrapped for travel and seated in the hall chair like a commander awaiting transport, said, If anyone means to depart before nightfall, less wit and more fastening would be welcome. Mrs. Wilmot came through carrying blankets. My lady, the road will not clear faster for being scolded. It might at least learn urgency. The weather has never yet taken orders from indoors, said Mrs. Wilmot. At the door, Weatherby stood receiving reports from the yard, with the gravity of a man supervising the conclusion of a campaign. One of the village men had come back to say the lower drift had given way. A carriage might pass, slowly and with respect. That produced a general movement. Colonel Ford came in carrying 2 smaller cases, set them down, and crossed the hall to Augusta. I believe, he said, that one of these is yours. Yes, thank you. He did not move away. When the road allows, he said, with his usual plainness, I should like to call upon you properly. Augusta's hand tightened by the smallest degree on the chair beside her. That would be agreeable, she said. Colonel Ford inclined his head, as if something important had been settled, and picked up another case without further display. Felix straightened suddenly. "We cannot leave like ordinary people." Mrs. Wilmot turned from the door. "That is because none of you arrived as ordinary people." "No, but we ought to mark it somehow. A final toast, perhaps, to survival, to potatoes, to Mrs. Wilmot's refusal to let us die." Lady Honoria looked as though she considered this excessive, but not wholly unsound. Weatherby said, after one grave glance round the hall, "There remains half a bottle from last evening." "Of course there does," cried Felix. "Briar is a house of hidden virtues." "It is a house of inventory," said Weatherby. But he went. A few minutes later they were gathered one last time in the drawing-room. Weatherby poured the wine with care enough for a banquet. Felix raised his glass. "To Briar, then?" "To Briar," said Adrian. They all echoed it, some warmly, some dutifully, and Mrs. Wilmot with the air of a woman indulging nonsense for the last time. Then Adrian said, more quietly, "And to the Christmas that happened here." That altered the room at once. Adrian was right. The grand Christmas, the polished one, with servants enough and every ribbon fresh and every course arriving on time, had never belonged to them at all. Their Christmas had happened here, with weak tea corrected, dinner argued into being, and comfort made by hand. Louisa lifted her glass a little. "To the Christmas that turned out better than it looked." Felix laughed first. Adrian smiled. Even Mrs. Wilmot's mouth gave the smallest sign of treachery. They drank to that. Afterward, the leaving happened quickly. Cloaks were gathered. Cases went out. Weatherby saw to the rugs. Mrs. Wilmot gave orders enough for a regiment and was obeyed as one. Lady Honoria took her place in the carriage, with the air of a woman permitting history to continue. Arabella followed, then paused and said to Mrs. Wilmot, "The pudding was excellent." Mrs. Wilmot looked at her. "I know, miss." Arabella laughed and got in. Felix shook Weatherby's hand with more feeling than elegance. Colonel Ford lifted in the last trunk. Augusta settled beside Louisa inside the carriage and folded her hands very neatly, which meant she was feeling a great deal. Adrian took his place opposite. When at last the horses started and Briar began to move away from them, Louisa looked back until the trees took it. Across from her, Adrian met her eyes. Nothing needed saying now. It had been the dearest Christmas she had ever known, and perhaps it was dearer for having gone wrong almost at once. Epilogue. A chosen Christmas. At Ashcroft, Christmas arrived properly and was none the worse for that. The house was not large enough to impress foolish people or grand enough to make sensible people uncomfortable. Holly stood in the hall in a blue and white bowl that had belonged to Adrian's grandmother. Candles waited on the drawing-room mantel. Somewhere beyond the green door to the back of the house, a cook of sound temper and stronger opinions was conducting Christmas dinner with the severity the day deserved. Louisa stood in the morning-room with a strip of ribbon in her hand, considering the greenery on the mantel. "It leans," Adrian said from the doorway. "It does not. It has ambitions to the left." She turned. He was carrying an armful of logs no one had asked him to carry, which had become a habit in him and one the servants bore with respectful despair. "You are in the wrong room," she said. "No, I am in the room where correction is most likely. That is the kitchen." He set down the logs by the hearth. "The kitchen threw me out. Mrs. Barnes said my presence made the gravy uncertain." Louisa laughed. He came to stand beside her and turned the ribbon one small degree. "There," he said, "you see? It did lean. It only wanted guidance." He was still easy in company, still well-dressed, still quite capable of crossing a room and leaving half of it liking him better than it had intended. But Briar had improved him in one important respect. He now carried things without being asked and knew what coal cost. Louisa straightened the cuff he had turned back carelessly over his wrist. If you bring in one more log unasked, the servants will begin to think you distrust them. I do distrust them, said Adrian, whenever snow is involved. She smiled, and because no one but the portraits could object, he bent and kissed her lightly before the knock came. They are here, said Weatherby. He had not changed at all. Louisa had borrowed him from Briar for the week. Adrian had declared Christmas at Ashcroft would be incomplete without him, and Mrs. Wilmot had said, with deep suspicion, that Weatherby might go if he wished, but would return with his standards permanently lowered. Now he stood as straight as a pike and said, Colonel and Mrs. Ford have arrived, and shortly after them Mr. Harcourt. Lady Honoria and Miss Sutton are in the drive. Louisa smiled at once. Augusta came in first, snow at the hem of her cloak and composure exactly where it belonged. Beside her came Colonel Ford, who looked much as he always had, plain, steady, weatherproof, and entirely unornamental, except for the fact that he now looked, in Augusta's vicinity, quietly pleased with life. Louisa embraced her warmly. Mrs. Ford. Augusta gave her a look. You know perfectly well I shall always be Augusta to you. Very well, Augusta. You look settled. I am. It suits me better than being discussed. Colonel Ford shook Adrian's hand. You have a clear road. For which I take no credit, Adrian said. The weather likes us better when we are indoors. It has poor judgment, said Augusta. Felix burst in behind them, bringing cold air, noise, and a parcel wrapped with enough paper to suggest either generosity or incompetence. I have come, he announced, to restore disorder. You are late, said Adrian. The house has managed that without you. Felix kissed Louisa's cheek, shook Adrian's hand as if renewing an alliance forged in snow, and looked round with delight. I knew it. You have made Ashcroft comfortable in the Briar style, he said. That, said Augusta, is not a recognized school of decoration. It ought to be. Fires, chairs, tea, and low moral standards about furniture placement. From the hall came Lady Honoria's voice. I cannot descend at this angle. Whoever designed these steps disliked his guests. Clearly, said Felix. The spite is plainly built in. Arabella entered a moment later, in dark plum velvet, prettier than ever and a little wiser for not knowing it. She kissed Louisa, accepted Adrian's hand with graceful seriousness, and then said, If there is a tray in this house, no one is to give it to me. Felix looked delighted. Better and better. Arabella coloured. I mean only to avoid repetition. Cowardice, said Felix. Experience, said Arabella. Lady Honoria came in behind her, magnificently shawled and already improving under the influence of the nearest fire. This room, she said, taking it in, is much better than Briar. Everything is much better than Briar if one includes stairs, said Felix. Lady Honoria ignored him. She looked at the fire, the holly, the chairs drawn up for comfort rather than spectacle. And then at Louisa. It is a very good room. That, from Lady Honoria, was praise of the reckless kind. Tea appeared when it ought to. The cakes were warm, and the chairs threatened no one. Arabella admired the candles, then surprised herself by asking whether the servants' hall had greenery too. Felix looked so moved by this decline into virtue that Augusta told him not to overact. Dinner was better than Briar's, as it ought to have been. Nothing had to be argued into existence. The pudding arrived without suspense. No one had soot on a cuff unless he had chosen it. Lady Honoria, after the second course, leaned back and said, This is how Christmas ought to behave. Mrs. Barnes, from the sideboard, heard her and looked gratified despite herself. Arabella, cutting her pudding with more interest than elegance, said, I like this house. That, said Felix, is because no one has yet asked you to transport breakfast upstairs. Arabella gave him a look. I have suffered enough for one mistake. One glorious mistake, said Felix. It gave Boxing Day character. It gave the stairs toast. Even Colonel Ford smiled at that, and Augusta, seeing him do it, smiled too. Later, when Lady Honoria had been established in the best chair, and Felix had begun a determined quarrel with the card table, Louisa stepped out for a moment into the hall. The house was warm. The bowl of holly shone dark and red beneath the lamp. Beyond the windows, the snow lay clean over the lawn, but this time it enclosed rather than trapped. Adrian came out a moment later and shut the drawing-room door softly behind him. "There you are," he said. "I had not gone far." "No," he said, coming to stand beside her. "That is one of Ashcroft's chief virtues. One cannot go far in it without meeting someone one belongs to." She looked up at him. "Its virtues improve under ownership." "It is not ownership, it is management." That is a dangerous thing to say to a woman in her own hall. "It is Christmas." "For another few hours." "Long enough." For a little while, they stood together, listening to the inhabited quiet of their own house. The murmur of voices beyond the door, the clink of china somewhere deeper in the passage, the small, efficient noises by which comfort announced it was being maintained. Adrian touched one of the holly leaves lightly. "I was thinking," he said, "that Briar did us one very great service." "Only one?" "It taught me that I liked Christmas much better when it had less display and more you." "That is almost too much." "No, only exact." He glanced toward the drawing-room door, where Felix was plainly losing at cards and declining to accept the fact. "At Briar," Adrian said, "everything went wrong and somehow improved itself. Here it has all gone right from the start, which I own I find less exciting but much better for the upholstery." Louisa laughed outright at that. He looked down at her. "Do you regret Wintermere?" "Never." "Nor do I." And because the house was theirs, and the hall was empty, and the holly overhead was doing its best to look ceremonial, he kissed her there, without haste and without any attempt at disguise. A moment later, Felix called from the drawing-room. "If you two are loitering in the hall for romantic purposes, do at least come in and lose money honorably with the rest of us." Louisa drew back smiling. "There," Adrian said. "Home." They went in together. And so, Briar is left warmer than it was found, with Christmas light, quiet laughter, and hearts not quite where they began. If you enjoyed this cozy Regency romance, another awaits. Listen to The Duke's Winter Bride, a full Regency romance audiobook where a quiet country woman shelters a wounded stranger with no memory, never suspecting that the man beneath her roof is a duke. As winter deepens, affection begins to grow, but love found in snow is not always easily kept. Tap the video on your screen to continue listening. I shall return soon with another romance, unless I am snowed in with a mysterious gentleman and obliged to nurse him back to himself.